Picture a compact sedan parked in a clearing, then imagine it breathing, blinking, and stepping soundlessly into the tree line. That is roughly the proposition a bull moose presents. A mature bull can tip the scales at over 1,500 pounds, a mass that rivals a subcompact automobile rolling off a dealer's lot. And yet, despite legs like fence posts and a rack of antlers wide enough to clear a doorway sideways, a moose in motion produces almost no sound. Its hooves splay and settle rather than crash, its weight distributed with a precision that seems to defy the sheer bulk behind it. Hunters and wildlife photographers alike describe the same unsettling experience. A moose appearing at the edge of a clearing, without a single snapped twig or rustled branch giving it away. This is not clumsiness wearing a disguise. It is an animal built for northern forests, thick with deadfall and brush, where noise means detection, and detection means danger, whether from wolves stalking a calf or a bull, avoiding an unnecessary confrontation. The stillness is functional, not accidental. What makes this especially disorienting for anyone who encounters a moose up close is the mismatch between expectation and reality. Something this large should announce itself. Instead, it arrives like a shadow with a heartbeat, and by the time most people register the shape in front of them, the moose has already been watching for several seconds. That quiet is the first clue that this animal plays by different rules than its size suggests. If you asked most people to name the most dangerous animal in Alaska, the answer would almost certainly involve fur fangs and a reputation built by decades of campfire stories. It would not be the moose. And yet, year after year, wildlife officials in Alaska report more human injuries caused by moose than by bears. No claws are involved. No predatory instinct drives it. What drives it instead is proximity, unpredictability, and sheer physical force. A moose does not need to want to hurt you. It simply needs to feel cornered, startled, or protective, and its size does the rest. Bears, for all their fearsome image, tend to avoid people when they can. Moose, especially in areas where they have grown used to human presence, often do not bother moving out of the way at all. They graze in yards, cross roads at their own pace, and bed down disturbingly close to hiking trails, treating human infrastructure as just another feature of the landscape. That familiarity breeds a dangerous kind of complacency both in the moose and in the people living around them. The animal is not hunting anyone. It is simply going about its life, and its life happens to involve immense strength and very little patience for perceived threats. The lesson wildlife agencies try to drive home is a simple one. The absence of teeth and claws does not mean the absence of risk. Sometimes the most dangerous animal in the room is the one nobody thought to be afraid of. Wolves have learned this lesson the hard way, and the ones who survive the education tend to remember it. When a wolf pack moves in on a moose, the danger does not come from teeth. It comes from the front legs. A moose delivers its most devastating attacks by rearing back and driving its hooves downward with tremendous force. A strike capable of breaking bone, caving in a skull, or ending a hunt permanently for whichever wolf gets too close. This is not a passive defense. It is an active, calculated weapon, one that moose deploy with startling accuracy, even under pressure from multiple attackers at once. Wolf packs that target moose often lose members in the process, and experienced packs have learned to work in coordinated rotations, wearing a moose down through exhaustion rather than risking a direct hoof strike. The reason this weapon works so well traces back to basic anatomy. Those long legs useful for stepping over deadfall and wading through snow double as levers, generating tremendous downward force when a moose commits to a strike. Unlike antlers, which only bulls carry and only for part of the year, every moose, male or female calf or adult, comes equipped with this defense from the moment it can stand. It is, in a sense, the great equalizer of the northern forest, a reminder that even the most feared predator in the region approaches a moose with genuine caution, because the moose was never actually defenseless to begin with. There is a particular kind of dread that comes from watching something enormous decide to move toward you on purpose. A bear's danger often lives in what you cannot see, the rustle in the brush, the presence sensed before it is spotted. A moose offers no such subtlety. When a moose charges, there is no stalking, no careful approach, no attempt at concealment. There is simply a sudden shift in posture, ears pinned back, hackles raised along the neck, and then several hundred pounds of muscle closing the distance in seconds. It is announced violence, blunt and unmistakable, the animal equivalent of a door being kicked open rather than picked. This directness is in its own way more unnerving than an ambush. There is no question of what is happening or why. You see it coming, and the sheer scale of what is coming leaves little room for negotiation or second guessing. Wildlife experts note that a moose rarely bluffs once it has committed to a charge. Body language readable moments earlier, ears back, hair raised, head lowered, gives way to full commitment almost immediately. That predictability, oddly enough, offers little comfort, since by the time the signs are obvious, there is often not much time left to react. The moose is not hunting, and it holds no interest in a meal. It wants distance, compliance, or a threat removed, and it pursues that goal with the same blunt honesty it brings to everything else in its enormous, deliberate life. Most large animals struck by a car end up on the hood, absorbing impact across a vehicle's front end, built specifically to manage exactly that kind of collision. A moose defeats that design entirely, and the reason comes down to leg length. Because a moose's body sits so high above its long legs, a car striking one at speed often clips the legs first, sending the massive torso crashing directly into the windshield rather than the hood. What should be a survivable impact becomes something far more dangerous, with the animal's full weight landing squarely where the driver and any passengers are sitting. This grim physics explains why moose collisions carry a disproportionately high rate of serious injury and death compared to crashes. Highway departments across moose country, from Maine to Alaska to the rural roads of Scandinavia, have poured resources into reflective signage, roadside clearing, and public education campaigns, specifically because standard collision safety measures do not account for an animal shaped quite like this one. Drivers are urged to slow down significantly in known moose corridors, particularly at dawn and dusk when moose tend to move and visibility drops. It is a sobering reminder that the same long legs which let a moose stride effortlessly through deep snow and thick brush also happen to place its enormous body at exactly the worst possible height for anyone approaching in a car. Consider the color palette of a moose, deep brown to nearly black, with no pale rump patch or bright marking to catch a passing beam of light the way a deer's does. Now place that animal on a dark, unlit rural highway at dusk, standing motionless the way moose often do when startled rather than fleeing. The result is a genuinely dangerous kind of camouflage not evolved for hiding from headlights, of course, but effective against them all the same. Moose eyes, unlike those of deer, do not reflect light back with the same dramatic glow that drivers rely on to spot animals from a distance, further reducing the visual warning a driver might expect. By the time a moose becomes visible in headlights, especially on a foggy or rain-slicked night, the distance remaining to react safely can shrink to almost nothing. This is not a hypothetical concern dreamed up by insurance companies. It is a documented pattern behind thousands of serious collisions each year across northern states and provinces, concentrated heavily in the low-light hours of early morning and early evening. When moose are most active and human, visibility is at its weakest. Transportation officials in moose-heavy regions have experimented with everything from wider road clearing to raised reflective markers, all in an effort to compensate for an animal that essentially disappears into the darkness, inhabits every single night of its life, whether or not a car happens to be coming. For most of the year, a bull moose keeps to himself, content to browse alone and avoid confrontation whenever possible. Come autumn, something changes. The rut arrives, hormone levels spike, and the same animal that spent the summer quietly minding its own business becomes agitated, territorial, and prone to challenging anything that crosses its path. Cars, mailboxes, hikers, even its own reflection in a parked vehicle's window. This is not random aggression. It is a seasonal recalibration driven entirely by the pressure to compete for mates, and it transforms a bull's temperament almost overnight. Wildlife officials in moose country treat the rutting season, typically running through September and into early October, as a period requiring extra public caution, issuing reminders each year that a bull behaving oddly calm one week can turn combative the next. The change is not permanent, and by winter, most bulls settle back into their usual reserved habits, energy spent and priorities shifted towards simple survival through the cold months ahead. But for those few crucial weeks, a bull moose operates according to a different internal calendar. One where hesitation carries a cost he is no longer willing to pay. Anyone who has watched the same animal graze peacefully in July, only to charge a fence post in late September, understands just how completely the rut can rewrite a moose's disposition, however briefly. There is perhaps no more reliably dangerous moment in the northern woods than standing between a cow moose and her calf, even unknowingly. Unlike the more telegraphed aggression of a rutting bull, a defensive cow often skips the warning signs entirely, moving from apparent calm to full charge in the space of a single breath. Her weapon of choice is a coordinated double strike, both front hooves driving down together with enough combined force to injure or kill whatever she has decided is a threat, wolf, bear, or unfortunate hiker who wandered too close to a calf hidden in the brush. This ferocity is not cruelty, it is devotion translated into physical force. The same protective instinct found across the animal kingdom, but delivered here through 1,500 pounds of committed maternal muscle. Wildlife agencies in states with healthy moose populations issue seasonal warnings each spring, specifically because calving season creates so many of these dangerous accidental encounters, often involving dogs off leash, or hikers who simply did not see the calf tucked into nearby brush before the mother made her presence known. What makes cow moose especially unpredictable during this window is the absence of the buildup that sometimes precedes a bull's charge. There is no lengthy posturing, no extended standoff. There is simply a threat assessment made in an instant, and a response delivered with everything the mother has, because for a few crucial weeks each spring, that calf is the only thing that matters to her. A pickup truck feels like a reasonable defense against most things a rural road might throw at a driver, sturdy high off the ground, built with a frame meant to absorb a hit. A full-grown moose renders that confidence obsolete. Because of the mismatch in height between a moose's body and a truck's windshield, even a vehicle designed for rough terrain and heavy impact can be catastrophically damaged in a single collision, the moose's torso crashing through the cabin rather than crumpling harmlessly against the front end. Insurance data from moose-heavy regions consistently ranks these collisions among the most severe involving any animal species on the road, worse in outcome than crashes involving elk, deer, or even livestock. The physics simply do not favor the vehicle. Speed compounds the danger further. A truck traveling at highway speed does not have time to shed enough momentum before impact, and the moose weighing close to what the truck itself weighs does not move out of the way so much as it becomes part of the wreck. Rural stretches of highway through Maine, Minnesota, and much of Scandinavia post reduced speed limits specifically around dusk and dawn for exactly this reason. It is a sobering fact for anyone who has ever felt a little too secure behind the wheel of something large and heavy that no amount of steel between a driver and the road fully cancels out an animal built on this scale, moving with this much unstoppable momentum behind it. The list of things a moose has decided to chase reads less like a wildlife report and more like a strange inventory of modern outdoor recreation. Joggers startled mid-run, cross-country skiers gliding a little too close to a resting animal, parked snowmobiles, engines off apparently, mistaken for some kind of rival or threat. None of these targets pose any real danger to a moose, and none of them are prey in any conventional sense, yet moose have charged all of them sometimes with startling persistence. Wildlife biologists chalk this up to a low threshold for perceived threat combined with poor eyesight, an animal that reacts first to sudden movement or an unfamiliar shape and sorts out the details only afterward, if at all. A moose does not pause to assess whether a jogger in bright spandex intends harm. It reads speed, proximity, and unfamiliarity, and responds according to instincts honed for wolves, not weekend athletes. Ski resorts and cross-country trail systems in moose territory across the northern United States and Canada now post regular signage warning visitors to give any moose sighted on a trail a wide, unhurried berth, since sudden retreat can sometimes trigger the very chase a person is hoping to avoid. There is something almost comic about the image of a moose thundering after a stationary snowmobile, and something entirely serious about what happens if that same animal decides a person jogging past qualifies as worth the same reaction. Drive through rural Sweden or Norway, and the diamond-shaped moose crossing sign becomes a familiar companion appearing again and again along stretches of forest highway where the animal's presence is less a possibility than a certainty. These signs exist because the numbers demanded it. Scandinavian countries record thousands of moose vehicle collisions each year, a toll significant enough that road planners have adjusted speed limits, cleared roadside vegetation to improve sightlines, and in some areas installed wildlife fencing, specifically engineered with moose proportions in mind, tall enough to prevent an animal that stands over 6 feet at the shoulder from simply stepping over a barrier meant for smaller deer. Sweden in particular has invested in underpasses designed to let moose cross beneath busy roads, entirely an expensive but increasingly common solution in corridors with the highest collision rates. The urgency behind these measures traces back to the same brutal physics found on roads in Maine or Alaska, a mismatch between a moose's height and a vehicle's structural design that turns routine collisions into serious, sometimes fatal events. What sets Scandinavia apart is simply density. With healthy moose populations moving through forests that border major roadways, the opportunities for encounters multiply, and the region has spent decades refining infrastructure around a hard truth: that no amount of signage alone fully prevents an animal this large from occasionally choosing the wrong moment to cross. It is worth sitting with the actual scale of this for a moment, because most people badly underestimate it. A moose, despite its bulk, is capable of covering the length of a football field, all 100 yards of it, in well under 10 seconds once it commits to a full charge. That is a pace competitive with a trained sprinter delivered by an animal that outweighs most cars. This speed does not come from grace so much as raw stride length. Those long legs that carry a moose effortlessly through deep snow eat up ground at an astonishing rate once the animal decides to move with purpose. The gap between how far away a moose appears safe and how quickly that distance can disappear catches people off guard constantly. which is precisely why wildlife officials insist on maintaining generous space around any moose encountered in the wild, far more than instinct alone might suggest is necessary. There simply is not enough time to reconsider a decision once a moose has closed even half that distance. This speed, held briefly and only under provocation, exists for the same reason as the kick and the charge itself. A defense mechanism built for a world of wolves and rival bulls, not parking lots and hiking trails, but no less real or dangerous for having been designed with different opponents in mind. There is a certain irony in the fact that some of the same wilderness safety guidelines built around grizzly bears now apply nearly word for word to an animal most people would never think to fear the same way. In towns across Alaska, Montana, and parts of the Rocky Mountain region where both species overlap, wildlife agencies recommend keeping at least 25 yards of distance from a moose, the same buffer typically advised for a grizzly, and sometimes more if a calf or the rutting season is involved. This recommendation did not arrive lightly. It reflects years of incident reports showing that moose-related injuries, while rarely fatal compared to bear attacks, occur with startling frequency, often in situations where a person simply misjudged how close was too close. The comparison to grizzlies tends to land with people in a way that generic warnings do not. Nobody needs convincing to stay far from a bear, but plenty of people assume a herbivore with no claws poses a lesser threat, an assumption wildlife officials have worked hard to correct. Local safety campaigns in moose-heavy communities now frame the two animals side by side, deliberately using the bear's fearsome reputation to borrow some healthy respect for an animal that pound for pound causes just as much harm through sheer unpredictability and force. It is an unusual pairing on paper: prey animal and apex predator held to the same safety standard. But the injury statistics make the logic difficult to argue with. Antlers exist first and foremost as a tool for competition between bulls, a visual and physical instrument built for autumn contests over mates rather than for use against people. That said, the rare moments when a bull moose does turn its antlers toward a human threat reveal just how capable a weapon they truly are. A wide, palm-shaped rack, studded with sharp points, can deliver deep, penetrating wounds with a single lowered head thrust, an outcome witnessed occasionally in cases where a bull felt sufficiently cornered or provoked, often by dogs, sometimes by people who approached too closely during the rut. These incidents remain uncommon precisely because a moose has other tools it reaches for. First, its hooves, its sheer bulk, a charge that rarely requires the added commitment of lowering antlers into an attack. But when antlers do come into play, the precision and force behind them make clear that this is not simply decorative headgear grown for show. Each point has been sharpened by months of scraping bark and rubbing against trees to shed the velvet covering, leaving behind a genuinely dangerous structure by the time autumn arrives. Wildlife biologists studying moose behavior note that antler-based attacks tend to correlate closely with the rutting season, when a bull's tolerance for perceived challenges drops, and the antlers, freshly hardened and finally free of velvet, sit ready for exactly the kind of confrontation they evolved to settle. Anchorage occupies an unusual position among American cities, a genuine urban center that also happens to sit squarely inside prime moose habitat, and the injury statistics reflect that overlap directly. Year after year, moose account for more reported human injuries within city limits than any other animal bears, included a fact that surprises visitors far more than it surprises residents, who have grown accustomed to moose wandering through backyards, along bike paths, and across busy intersections without much concern for zoning laws. The city's relationship with its moose population is a study in coexistence under pressure. Wildlife officials field hundreds of moose-related calls annually, ranging from minor traffic disruptions to genuine safety incidents involving people who got too close, often while trying to photograph a moose calmly browsing beside a suburban driveway. Local schools in Anchorage have at various points implemented moose-specific safety protocols, teaching children what to do if a moose is spotted on the walk home. Guidance that would sound almost absurd in most American cities, but registers as entirely routine here. The persistence of this pattern decade after decade speaks to something deeper than simple bad luck or occasional bad judgment. It reflects an animal that has adapted comfortably to urban edges, unbothered by traffic or fences, while carrying all the same instincts and physical capabilities it would rely on deep in the surrounding forest. The stomping attack a cow moose delivers did not evolve with hikers or dogs in mind. It evolved to answer wolves, and on occasion bears bold enough to test a mother defending her calf, and the force behind it reflects that original, far more dangerous intended target. A direct strike from a cow's front hooves carries enough power to crush ribs, rupture organs, or break bones outright, an outcome documented in wolf carcasses recovered near contested calving sites. Animals that misjudged the risk and paid for it immediately. This is not aggression born of temperament so much as a precisely calibrated response tuned over evolutionary time to end a confrontation with a genuine predator as quickly and decisively as possible. When that same defense mechanism gets triggered by a person or a pet who unknowingly wandered too close to a hidden calf, the outcome carries no less force, simply because the intended recipient was different. The cow does not distinguish between a testing wolf and a curious dog off its leash. Both register as a threat to be met with everything she has. This is part of why wildlife officials treat spring calving season with such consistent seriousness in public messaging, not because cow moose are inherently vicious animals, but because the defensive tools available to them were built for a much harder fight than the ones they occasionally end up having instead. Strip away the antlers, the massive frame, even the reputation, and a moose is at the end of the day an herbivore, an animal that wants nothing from a person except distance and the freedom to keep browsing. And yet across North America, wildlife safety statistics consistently place moose among the animals responsible for the most dangerous encounters people have in the wild. A ranking that has less to do with intent and everything to do with consequence. A moose is not hunting anyone. It carries no drive toward confrontation the way a predator might, no calculation about opportunity or prey. What it carries instead is enormous size, quick reflexes when startled, and a temperament that, particularly during rutting or calving season, tolerates very little in the way of perceived threat. That combination proves just as dangerous, sometimes more so than the presence of claws or fangs, because people tend to lower their guard around animals they do not associate with predation. This gap between perceived risk and actual risk is exactly what wildlife agencies spend so much effort trying to close through public education, reminding hikers, drivers, and homeowners alike that danger in the natural world does not always announce itself through obvious weaponry. Sometimes it simply announces itself through scale unpredictability, and an animal that never asked to be considered dangerous, but has through nothing more than its own biology, earned that reputation many times over. In most standoffs between a moose and something smaller, whether a dog, a person, or even another animal entirely, there is an unspoken calculation happening, and the moose almost always wins it. Being the largest land mammal in most of the ecosystems it inhabits means a moose has very little evolutionary incentive to retreat from a confrontation. Since almost nothing it regularly encounters poses a genuine threat to an adult in good health. This translates into a kind of quiet default confidence, an animal that holds its ground not out of aggression but out of a simple lack of reason to move. For anyone caught in one of these standoffs, the effect can be deeply unsettling, since the instinctive human expectation that a large animal will eventually yield space the way people generally do with each other simply does not apply here. The moose is not posturing or bluffing when it refuses to budge from a trail or a backyard. It genuinely has no built-in reason to consider retreat the safer option. Wildlife officials frequently note that the safest resolution to this kind of standoff involves the person, not the moose, backing away slowly and deliberately, ceding ground to an animal that by every measure of size and force has already won the argument before it properly began. If there is one factor that shows up again and again in the most severe moose attack reports, it is not hikers, not photographers, not even careless drivers. It is dogs, particularly those allowed to run off leash near a moose that has not noticed them yet or has decided their presence constitutes a threat. Moose appear to have a particularly strong, deeply rooted aversion to canines, likely rooted in millions of years of wolf predation, shaping their instincts, and a barking, darting dog can trigger a defensive response far more intense and immediate than almost any other stimulus a moose regularly encounters. The tragedy in many of these incidents is that the dog itself often survives relatively unscathed fast enough to escape, while the dog's owner, following close behind or attempting to intervene, absorbs the moose's full response instead. Wildlife agencies across moose territory have leaned hard into leash law enforcement specifically because of this pattern, treating it as one of the most preventable causes of serious moose-related injury. A moose that would otherwise ignore a person walking calmly along a trail can transform instantly into a genuine threat the moment a dog enters the picture, chasing, barking, or simply moving unpredictably nearby. It is a sobering reminder that the danger in these encounters often has less to do with the moose's baseline temperament and everything to do with what or who happens to be accompanying the person who crossed its path. By now, the pattern should be clear. Everything dangerous about a moose traces back not to weaponry in the traditional sense, no fangs, no venom, no claws built for tearing, but to temperament, timing, and sheer physical scale. A moose that feels cornered, startled, protective of a calf, or hormonally charged during the rut becomes a genuinely serious threat, while that same animal, encountered calmly and from a respectful distance during an ordinary afternoon in early summer, poses almost no danger at all. This distinction matters enormously for anyone living in or visiting moose country because it shifts the entire framework for staying safe. You are not managing the risk of an inherently aggressive predator. You are managing your understanding of context, season, behavior, and body language in an animal whose default state is actually calm, watchful indifference. Wildlife officials across every region with a healthy moose population return to the same core guidance again and again. Give it space. Watch for warning signs like raised hackles or pinned ears, and never assume calm behavior in one moment guarantees calm behavior in the next. The moose was never the villain of this story. It is simply an enormous, powerful animal doing what enormous, powerful animals have always done, responding to its environment on its own terms, terms that occasionally and briefly put it directly at odds with ours. Step away now from danger and towards something almost as hard to believe. Each spring, a bull moose begins growing an entirely new set of antlers from scratch, and during the peak weeks of summer, that growth can occur at a rate of nearly an inch a day, among the fastest bone growth recorded anywhere in the animal kingdom. To put that in terms an old-fashioned tape measure could track, a bull could start a week with antlers roughly the length of a dinner fork and end it with something closer to a fireplace poker, all built from nothing in a matter of days. This is not slow, incremental growth measured in seasons. It is a biological sprint, fueled by an intense metabolic demand that requires a bull to consume enormous quantities of vegetation just to keep pace with what his own body is constructing. Scientists studying antler growth describe it as one of the fastest growing tissues found in any mammal, a rate that would be biologically catastrophic to sustain year-round, but proves entirely manageable across the compressed window of a single growing season. The engineering required to support that speed, delivering the necessary calcium, protein, and blood supply fast enough to keep the growing structure alive and functional, remains an area of active scientific interest, precisely because so few other animals attempt anything remotely similar. Before a moose's antlers harden into the imposing weapon-like structure recognizable each autumn, they exist in a far softer, stranger form, covered entirely in a thin layer of skin known as velvet threaded through with blood, vessels that keep the rapidly growing bone beneath alive and nourished. Touch a growing antler during this phase, something wildlife researchers occasionally do under controlled conditions, and it feels warm, almost alive, in a way that seems at odds with the idea of antlers as inert, bony headgear. That warmth is not incidental. It reflects an active living structure under construction, one that requires a constant supply of nutrients delivered directly through the velvet's dense network of blood vessels in order to grow at the astonishing pace it does each summer. Once the antlers reach full size in late summer, that velvet begins to dry, crack, and eventually strip away entirely, often assisted by the bull himself, as he rubs and scrapes the antlers against tree trunks and low branches, a process that can look almost violent from a distance, but serves a simple, practical purpose. Beneath the peeling velvet lies bone that has by this point hardened, completely transforming from a living blood-fed structure into the solid, weaponized rack a bull will carry through the rutting season ahead, entirely dead tissue by the time it matters most. After all that effort, all that rapid growth and careful development through the summer months, a bull moose does something that seems on its face deeply wasteful. Sometime after the rutting season concludes, typically in early winter, the antlers simply fall off, dropping away from the skull entirely, leaving behind nothing but two bare pedicles where an elaborate rack once stood. This is not injury or accident. It is a built-in biological cycle repeated every single year of a bull's adult life, an enormous structure grown from nothing each spring only to be discarded each winter and rebuilt again from scratch the following season. The reasoning behind this costly annual cycle traces back to resource management. Carrying that much weight and bone structure year-round would place an unnecessary metabolic burden on a bull through the leanest months of winter when food is scarce and energy conservation matters most. Shedding the antlers lightens that load precisely when it counts. Fallen antlers do not simply vanish from the forest floor either. They become a valuable calcium source for rodents and other small mammals, gnawed down slowly over subsequent months, in a quiet second act most people never witness. Come spring, the pedicles begin producing new velvet-covered growth once again, and the entire remarkable cycle restarts. An act of biological renewal repeated so many times across a bull's life that it barely registers as remarkable to the animal doing it. Here is an image that tends to surprise even people who think they know moose reasonably well. During summer, a moose will wade into a pond, lower its enormous head completely beneath the surface and hold it there, submerged entirely while grazing on aquatic plants growing along the bottom. This is not a brief dunk or a passing curiosity. Moose have been observed keeping their heads underwater for stretches approaching a full minute at a time, an impressive feat of breath control for a land mammal never mistaken for anything resembling a seal or an otter. The behavior exists for a practical reason. Since some of the most nutrient-rich vegetation available to a moose during summer grows submerged in shallow ponds and slow-moving streams, plants a moose simply cannot reach without committing its entire head, and sometimes much, of its upper body beneath the water. Watching this happen from a distance produces a strange, almost comic tableau. An enormous animal standing motionless in a pond with nothing visible above the surface, but its back and the top of its shoulders, antlers occasionally breaking the water like some oversized waterlogged branch. For anyone who grew up thinking of deer as animals that avoid water whenever possible, a moose fully submerging its head to graze offers a genuine recalibration of what this family of animals is actually capable of doing when the right meal calls for it. The mechanics behind a moose's underwater grazing habit go deeper than simple willpower or breath holding. Inside each nostril, a moose possesses a specialized fold of tissue that acts almost like a valve sealing, shut automatically the moment the head submerges, and keeping water from flooding the airway during those long head-down feeding sessions. This is not a behavior the moose has to think about or control consciously. It functions more like a reflex triggered by submersion itself, similar in principle to the way certain diving mammals manage water exposure, though a moose arrived at this solution independently shaped entirely by its own evolutionary path, rather than borrowed from anything resembling a seal or a whale. Researchers who have studied moose anatomy closely describe this nasal adaptation as one of the more understated engineering marvels found anywhere in the deer family. Easy to overlook because it operates silently and out of sight, yet essential to a feeding strategy few other large land mammals attempt with any regularity. Without this seal, repeated submersion for aquatic foraging would risk water entering the lungs with every dip, a serious hazard for an animal that needs to keep grazing steadily through the nutrient-rich weeks of summer. Instead, a moose can lower its head again and again, pond after pond, season after season, with a built-in safeguard doing its job automatically each time, unnoticed and unremarkable to the animal wearing it. Most large herbivores keep their feeding firmly rooted on solid ground, grazing grass, stripping leaves, or browsing shrubs without ever needing to consider what lies beneath a body of water. Moose break that pattern in a genuinely unusual way, ranking among the very few large land mammals documented diving deliberately, submerging fully in pursuit of food growing along pond and lake bottoms rather than simply wading in shallows to nibble at surface vegetation. This sets moose apart even from close relatives like elk and white-tailed deer animals that may occasionally step into water but rarely commit to anything resembling true underwater foraging. The behavior likely developed as a response to a specific seasonal opportunity, aquatic plants rich in sodium and other nutrients scarce elsewhere in a moose's summer diet, valuable enough to justify the unusual effort and vulnerability of fully submerging in open water, a moment when a moose is notably exposed to predators and unable to watch its surroundings. Scientists studying moose foraging patterns have noted that this diving behavior tends to intensify during specific weeks of summer, correlating closely with when certain sodium-rich aquatic plants reach peak availability. It is a striking example of how a single seasonal nutritional need can push an animal toward behavior that looks on the surface almost entirely out of character for anything belonging to the deer family. Look closely at a moose's face, and the upper lip stands out as unusually large, soft, and mobile functioning, less like the rigid mouth parts found on most grazing animals, and more like a specialized tool built specifically for the job at hand. This flexible upper lip allows a moose to grasp and manipulate vegetation, with surprising precision wrapping around individual stems, twigs, and aquatic plants, and pulling them free with a kind of dexterity that would be entirely unnecessary for an animal simply chewing grass off the ground. The comparison researchers sometimes reach for a small working hand, rather than a typical mouth, captures the functional role this lip plays, especially when a moose is foraging underwater or stripping bark from thin branches during winter months when little else remains available. Cold water only adds to the challenge this adaptation solves, since a moose feeding on submerged plants must manipulate slippery, often delicate vegetation, while its head remains fully underwater, unable to rely on sight to guide the process. The lip compensates through sheer sensitivity and flexibility, effectively feeling its way toward the right plant material, even in murky cold conditions. This same adaptability serves moose well in winter too, allowing them to selectively strip the most nutritious bark and twig tips from woody browse, rather than indiscriminately chewing whatever happens to be nearest. A small but meaningful efficiency across the leanest months of the year. Human hearing operates as something of a package deal, both ears generally oriented in the same rough direction, working together rather than separately. A moose's ears follow an entirely different design, each one capable of rotating independently, swiveling toward a specific sound source without requiring the other ear to follow along. This means a moose can, in effect, monitor two entirely separate directions simultaneously. One ear angled toward a rustling sound behind it, while the other remains fixed on movement somewhere, off to the side, gathering a much broader picture of its surroundings than a single-day, fixed pair of ears could ever manage. For an animal that spends much of its life alone in dense forest, without the safety net of a herd's collective vigilance that many other deer species rely on, this independent ear rotation functions as a genuine survival advantage, a built-in early warning system that never has to fully commit its attention in just one direction. Wildlife researchers observing moose in the field often note this behavior, specifically during moments of heightened alertness, ears swiveling almost mechanically as the animal processes competing sounds without turning its head or breaking its feeding rhythm. It is a small anatomical detail, easy to miss at a glance, but it reveals a great deal about how a fundamentally solitary animal manages the constant low-level vigilance required to survive in a landscape shared with wolves, bears, and the occasional, unpredictable human encounter. For an animal built with such formidable size and such sharp hearing, a moose's eyesight lags noticeably behind, tuned far more toward detecting motion than resolving fine detail, a trade-off that produces some genuinely strange behavioral quirks. A moose can often fail to notice a person standing perfectly still at a modest distance even in relatively open terrain, while reacting instantly and dramatically to the slightest sudden movement from that same person. This helps explain some of the more startling encounters people report moose that seem entirely unaware of a nearby observer until a phone is raised for a photo, at which point the animal's head snaps toward the movement immediately. The evolutionary logic behind this trade-off likely traces back to the specific threats a moose evolved to detect sudden fast movement associated with a lunging predator, mattering far more historically than the ability to make out fine detail across a stationary landscape. Combined with the moose's already excellent sense of smell and hearing, weaker eyesight becomes less of a liability and more of a specialization, one sense scaled back because the others already carry much of the necessary workload. For hikers and photographers, this quirk carries a practical lesson, since remaining still rather than freezing dramatically or moving suddenly often proves the safer choice when a moose has not yet noticed a person's presence nearby. Whatever a moose's eyesight lacks in sharpness, its sense of smell more than compensates for capable of detecting scent, whether from an approaching predator or a potential mate during rutting season from distances exceeding a mile, under favorable wind conditions. This remarkable olfactory range functions as the moose's primary long-distance sensory tool, filling in the gaps left by weaker eyesight, and giving the animal crucial advance warning long before any visual or auditory cue would register. During the rut, this sense becomes especially critical with bulls capable of tracking a cow's scent trail across considerable distances, following subtle chemical signals through dense forest terrain that would leave a human tracker hopelessly lost within minutes. The same sensitivity applies in reverse during moments of danger, allowing a moose to detect the presence of wolves or bears well before any visual confirmation, giving it precious extra time to decide whether to flee, stand its ground, or simply move toward denser cover. Researchers studying moose behavior have noted that wind direction plays an enormous role in how effectively this sense operates, meaning a moose's awareness of its surroundings can shift dramatically depending on something as simple as which way the breeze happens to be blowing on a given afternoon. It is a reminder that for all the moose's impressive physical presence, much of its survival strategy depends on senses operating quietly, continuously, and largely invisibly to any casual observer. A moose's legs deserve more credit than they typically receive. Long, stilt-like limbs that lift its body well above the tangled deadfall, dense brush, and uneven terrain that would slow or entirely stop many smaller forest animals. Where a white-tailed deer might need to navigate carefully around a fallen log or push awkwardly through a thicket, a moose can often simply step directly over the same obstacle without breaking stride, its elevated stance turning what would be a barrier for other animals into little more than a minor inconvenience. This leg length becomes especially valuable in the dense, often swampy boreal forests. Moose call home terrain thick with downed timber brush and standing water that rewards exactly this kind of elevated, long-striding mobility. The advantage extends beyond simple obstacle clearance too, since those same long legs allow a moose to move efficiently through shallow water and soft, muddy ground where shorter-legged animals would struggle or sink. Wildlife biologists studying moose locomotion have noted that this leg structure represents a clear adaptation to the specific habitat. Moose occupy a body built not for speed across open plains, but for efficient obstacle clearing, movement through the cluttered wet forest floor of the north. It is one more example of how nearly every unusual feature of a moose's body traces back to the specific demands of the landscape it has called home for a very long time. Winter in moose country means snow piled deep enough to stop most animals in their tracks, yet moose continue moving through it with relative ease, thanks in large part to hooves specifically adapted for exactly this challenge. Each hoof can spread wide upon contact with soft snow, distributing the animal's considerable weight across a broader surface area in a manner strikingly similar to a snowshoe strapped onto a hiker's boot. This spreading action reduces how deeply a moose sinks with every step, conserving precious energy during a season when food is scarce, and every wasted movement carries a real metabolic cost. Without this adaptation, a moose's enormous weight would work directly against it in deep snow, sinking with each stride and turning simple movement into an exhausting, energy-draining ordeal. Wildlife researchers have documented moose navigating snow depths that would leave smaller deer species struggling or entirely stranded, a direct testament to how effectively this hoof design compensates for the animal's substantial bulk. The trade-off arrives in summer, when that same broad, splayed hoof shape proves less ideal for solid dry ground, a seasonal shift addressed elsewhere in the moose's remarkably adaptable anatomy. For now, though, in the depths of a northern winter, that snowshoe-like spread stands as one of the quieter, less celebrated reasons a moose can survive conditions that would challenge almost any other large mammal sharing its range. The same hooves that spread so effectively across deep winter snow do not remain fixed in that shape year-round. As seasons shift and snow gives way to bare ground, a moose's hooves undergo a subtle but meaningful change, narrowing and firming to better suit the drier, more solid terrain of summer, along with the soft, sucking mud found around the wetlands and pond edges where moose spend so much of the warmer months. This seasonal adjustment reflects a genuine trade-off in hoof function, since the broad splayed shape so useful for distributing weight across snow would actually work against a moose navigating summer terrain, offering less traction and precision on firmer ground, or in the specific kind of thick, clinging mud found at a pond's edge. A narrower hoof cuts through that mud more efficiently, providing better grip and stability exactly when a moose needs to move confidently through the wetland habitat it relies on most heavily during the growing season. Researchers studying hoof structure across seasons describe this as a genuinely elegant piece of biological engineering, an animal essentially reshaping its own feet in response to shifting environmental demands without any conscious effort or intervention required. It stands as one more example of how thoroughly a moose's body has been shaped by the specific, sometimes contradictory challenges of life in the north. Deep snow one season, thick mud the next, each demanding a slightly different tool for the job. Above each of a moose's main hooves sits a smaller secondary structure called a dew claw, a feature easy to overlook but genuinely useful when the ground turns treacherous. On steep icy slopes or uneven forest terrain littered with roots and loose rock, these dew claws can make contact with the ground alongside the primary hooves, providing an extra measure of grip and stability that helps prevent a moose from slipping during exactly the kind of terrain where a fall could prove seriously injurious for an animal of such considerable size and weight. This additional traction becomes particularly valuable during the transitional seasons, early winter ice or late spring thaw, when footing throughout the boreal forest grows unpredictable and inconsistent from one step to the next. Wildlife biologists studying moose movement patterns have observed the animals adjusting their gait subtly on especially difficult terrain, weight shifting in ways that suggest the dew claws are doing real functional work rather than simply riding along as evolutionary leftovers. It is a small structural detail tucked just above the more obvious main hoof, yet it reflects the same underlying theme found throughout a moose's anatomy: nothing wasted, every feature contributing in some meaningful way to survival, across genuinely difficult northern terrain. For an animal that spends its entire life navigating forests never designed with easy footing in mind, that extra grip above each hoof represents one more quiet advantage built directly into the body. Run a hand across a moose's coat, and the texture alone hints at something unusual happening beneath the surface, a coarseness that comes from hair structured quite differently than the fur found on most familiar mammals. Each individual hair on a moose's body is hollow, a tiny air-filled tube rather than a solid strand, and that hollow structure functions as remarkably effective insulation, trapping warm air close to the body and creating a barrier against cold that performs something close to the job of a wetsuit, though built from keratin rather than neoprene. This insulation proves essential for an animal that spends its entire life in some of the coldest terrain found in North America and Northern Europe. routinely enduring winter temperatures that would prove lethal to less well-equipped mammals within hours. The hollow hair traps a substantial layer of insulating air directly against the skin, reducing heat loss dramatically, even as outside temperatures plunge well below freezing for weeks or months at a stretch. This same structural feature, as it happens, does double duty beyond simple warmth. A connection that becomes clear in exactly the kind of unexpected way nature tends to reuse a good design for more than one purpose. For now, consider the coat alone a coarse, unassuming covering that quietly performs one of the more sophisticated insulation jobs found anywhere in the animal kingdom, keeping an enormous body warm through winters that would otherwise prove genuinely unforgiving. That same hollow hair structure responsible for keeping a moose warm through brutal winters turns out to serve a second entirely different function once the animal enters open water. The trapped air inside each hollow strand provides genuine buoyancy, helping keep a moose's substantial body afloat and making it a far stronger, more capable swimmer than its bulky, land-built appearance would ever suggest. This is not a minor swimming ability either. Moose regularly cross rivers, lakes, and other bodies of water as a routine part of seasonal movement, relying on that built-in buoyancy to keep an animal weighing well over 1,000 pounds comfortably afloat rather than fighting a constant, exhausting battle against sinking. The image of a moose confidently paddling across open water tends to surprise people who picture deer family members as primarily land-bound creatures, but for a moose, swimming represents a genuinely practical skill useful for reaching prime feeding grounds, escaping, pursuing predators, or simply taking the most direct route between 2 points, separated by water rather than detouring miles around it. Wildlife researchers tracking moose movement have documented individuals swimming considerable distances without apparent difficulty, aided enormously by the same hair structure evolved. Originally, it seems to solve an entirely different problem involving cold rather than water. It stands as a small but genuinely elegant example of evolution repurposing one solution to quietly solve two very different survival challenges at once. Buoyancy alone does not fully explain just how capable a swimmer a moose turns out to be, and researchers tracking individual animals across large bodies of water have documented genuinely impressive distances covered without any apparent sign of exhaustion or struggle. Moose have been recorded swimming several miles across open lakes in a single continuous stretch, a distance that would represent a serious athletic undertaking for most land mammals, let alone one weighing well over 1,000 pounds and built primarily for forest travel rather than sustained aquatic endurance. This swimming stamina serves several practical purposes throughout a moose's life, offering a direct route across water that would otherwise require a lengthy detour on land. A means of escaping pursuing predators who may hesitate to follow into open water, and occasionally simply the most efficient path toward a particularly promising feeding area on the far shore of a lake or river. Wildlife biologists using tracking collars have gathered some of the clearest documentation of this behavior. Following individual moose across multi-mile aquatic crossings that once relied entirely on anecdotal observation from hunters and researchers stationed along known lake routes. The combination of buoyant, hollow-haired insulation and genuinely powerful sustained swimming ability adds up to an animal considerably more comfortable in open water than its lumbering, distinctly terrestrial appearance would ever lead a casual observer to guess one more quiet contradiction tucked into the biology of an animal that seems full of them. Beneath a moose's chin hangs a curious flap of loose skin, sometimes covered in longer hair, known among biologists as the bell. And despite decades of observation, its exact purpose remains a subject of ongoing scientific debate, rather than settled fact. Unlike antlers, whose function in competition and display is well understood, the bell resists easy explanation. Present on every moose, regardless of sex or age, yet serving no function that researchers have been able to pin down with full confidence. Some scientists have proposed it plays a role in scent dispersal, perhaps helping distribute pheromones during the rutting season in a way that aids in attracting mates or signaling reproductive status to other moose in the area. Others suggest a more purely visual function, a distinctive silhouette feature that helps moose recognize one another at a distance in dense forest terrain, where full-body visibility is often limited by brush and trees. Neither explanation has achieved full scientific consensus, and the bell remains even now one of the more genuinely mysterious anatomical features found on an animal that has otherwise been studied quite thoroughly. For a creature whose antlers, hooves, and hollow hair all serve clearly identifiable purposes, the bell stands out as a rare piece of unfinished business, a physical trait hanging quite literally in plain sight that science has not yet fully explained. Antlers come and go with the seasons grown fresh each spring and discarded each winter, present only on bulls and entirely absent through the coldest months of the year. The bell follows none of these rules. It appears on both male and female moose alike, present from a relatively young age and remaining a permanent fixture for the rest of the animal's life, never shed, never regrown, simply a constant physical feature carried year after year, regardless of season or sex. This permanence sets the bell apart from nearly every other distinctive physical trait associated with moose, most of which shift dramatically with the calendar antlers, growing and falling, coats thickening for winter and thinning for summer, hooves adjusting shape between snow and mud. The bell alone stays put, an unchanging feature on an animal, otherwise defined by seasonal transformation in nearly every other visible respect. This consistency has made the bell a subject of particular interest among researchers trying to understand its function, since a permanent trait present across both sexes typically suggests some ongoing, year-round purpose, rather than a seasonal one tied specifically to mating competition or winter survival. Whatever that purpose eventually proves to be, the bell remains a quiet, constant presence on every moose encountered anywhere across its range, a small dangling reminder that even a well-studied animal can still hold on to a genuine, unresolved mystery. Step back now and consider everything gathered across this stretch of strange, specialized anatomy: hooves that reshape themselves between snow and mud, nostrils that seal automatically underwater, hollow hair that both insulates against cold and provides buoyancy in open water, and a swimming stamina capable of crossing lakes that would exhaust most land mammals long before reaching the far shore. Very few animals anywhere combine this particular set of specialized adaptations within a single body. A snowshoe's stability for winter travel, a diver's functional seal against water for underwater feeding, and a genuine swimmer's endurance for crossing open lakes and rivers. Each feature on its own might register as a minor curiosity, but taken together they reveal an animal built with remarkable versatility across radically different environmental demands: deep snow, soft mud, and open water, each requiring its own distinct physical solution, and each solution present and ready within the same animal, depending entirely on the season and the terrain at hand. This is the quieter side of what makes a moose so genuinely uncanny once you look past its size and its reputation. Not simply large, but engineered with a level of adaptive specificity that rewards close attention. What comes next moves beyond the body entirely, toward the behavior and intelligence that this remarkably equipped animal puts to use every single day of its life in the northern forest. A moose does not wander its territory at random. Across the year, it follows a deliberate seasonal pattern, shifting between the wetlands and lowland forests, where it feeds heavily through spring and summer, and the higher, more sheltered forest terrain it favors once snow begins, accumulating in earnest. This movement is not instinct alone, operating on a fixed calendar. It responds directly to real, measurable conditions. Food availability shifting with the seasons and snow depth, gradually making certain areas impractical to navigate efficiently. As autumn gives way to winter, moose, in many regions, relocate to areas offering better cover and more accessible browse, often gathering loosely in what biologists call wintering yards. Spots where several individuals may occupy overlapping territory through the harshest months without the more solitary spacing typical of summer. Come spring, that same population disperses back out toward the wetlands and pond systems where calving occurs and where the season's richest vegetation becomes available again. This seasonal rhythm plays out reliably enough that wildlife biologists can predict with reasonable confidence roughly where a given moose population will concentrate at different points across the year, a pattern shaped over countless generations by the simple, practical math of finding enough food while expending as little unnecessary energy as possible in a landscape that never stops presenting new challenges depending on the month. Among the more quietly impressive aspects of moose behavior is the tendency for cows to return to the same specific calving site year after year, often with a precision that suggests something more deliberate than simple habit. Researchers, using tracking collars, have documented individual cows returning to locations within a remarkably small radius of previous year's calving grounds, choosing the same patch of wetland or forest edge repeatedly across multiple breeding seasons rather than selecting new sites at random. This consistency likely reflects a learned understanding of what makes a particular location genuinely safe and productive: adequate cover from predators, reliable access to food and water, and terrain familiar enough that a cow can navigate it confidently while distracted by the demands of a newborn calf. The behavior raises real questions. Researchers continue to investigate since it implies a level of spatial memory and site fidelity that goes beyond simple reflexive habit, suggesting cows may be weighing past outcomes, successful births, surviving calves, when deciding where to return the following spring. This pattern of sight fidelity is not unique to moose among large mammals, but the precision documented in some tracked individuals stands out even within that broader context, a reminder that an animal often characterized primarily by its size and physical presence is also quietly making calculated, memory-driven decisions about some of the most consequential moments of its life. Watch a moose move through winter terrain, and the path it chooses rarely looks accidental, even when no obvious trail or landmark explains the specific route selected. Researchers studying moose movement patterns increasingly believe the animals are reading subtle environmental cues: snow crust, firmness, the density and type of nearby vegetation, even slight variations in terrain elevation, to select routes that minimize energy expenditure while maximizing access to available browse along the way. This kind of route selection requires more than simple instinct reacting to immediate surroundings. It suggests an animal capable of integrating multiple pieces of environmental information into a coherent navigational decision. Choosing to cross a frozen pond at one particular point rather than another, or following a specific contour of higher ground rather than cutting more directly through deeper snow nearby. Some of this navigational sophistication likely develops through experience, younger moose learning efficient routes by following their mothers through a first winter or two, gradually building an internal map of a home range that accounts for exactly these kinds of subtle terrain variables. The precise mechanisms behind this route finding remain an active area of study, since separating genuine environmental reading from simple habitual pathing is difficult to establish with full confidence. What does seem clear is that the routes moose choose are rarely arbitrary, reflecting a quiet, ongoing calculation running beneath the surface of what looks at a glance like simple wandering. Within days of birth, a moose calf begins learning to recognize a specific low grunting call, unique to its own mother. A vocal signature the cow uses repeatedly to summon her calf, particularly in dense brush or forest, where visual contact alone cannot be relied upon. This call functions as a genuine communication tool rather than simple background noise. Distinct enough in tone and rhythm that researchers observing mother-calf pairs have documented calves responding specifically to their own mother's grunt, while showing little to no reaction when a different cow's call. It sounds nearby. The speed at which this recognition develops is itself notable, a newborn calf still unsteady on its legs and only days into its life, already capable of distinguishing one specific vocal pattern from the general soundscape of the forest around it. This early auditory bond likely plays a critical role in keeping mother and calf together through the vulnerable early weeks, particularly in thick vegetation, where a calf could easily become separated and difficult to relocate through sight alone. The grunt itself remains relatively simple in structure compared to the more elaborate vocal repertoire found in some other mammal species, but its consistency and the speed of calf recognition suggest a communication system finely tuned to solve one specific urgent problem: keeping a vulnerable newborn close during the exact period when separation would carry the highest possible risk. Most people picture newborn mammals as fragile, uncoordinated creatures requiring days or weeks before any meaningful mobility becomes possible. A moose calf defies that expectation almost immediately, typically managing to stand on its own within hours of birth, and not long after that beginning to follow its mother on short, unsteady excursions away from the birth site. This rapid mobility is not simply an impressive developmental milestone. It serves a genuinely critical survival function, since a newborn calf that remains immobile for an extended period represents an easy, vulnerable target for wolves, bears, or other predators drawn by the scent of a recent birth. By standing and moving within such a short window, a calf dramatically reduces this early window of maximum vulnerability, gaining at least some capacity to keep pace with its mother as she relocates away from a birth site that predators may already be investigating. The process is not graceful in those first attempts, legs splaying awkwardly, balance uncertain, but the underlying urgency behind the rapid development is unmistakable. Within just a few days, that same wobbly calf typically moves with far greater confidence and coordination, closing the gap between fragile newborn and genuinely mobile young animal remarkably fast. This compressed timeline reflects the same evolutionary pressure driving so much of moose biology, a landscape where vulnerability, especially early vulnerability, carries real and immediate consequences that natural selection has worked hard to minimize wherever possible. When danger approaches, a cow moose does not simply flee alongside her calf, hoping both make it to safety together. Instead, she typically positions her own body directly between the calf and whatever threat has appeared, absorbing the first point of contact herself, rather than allowing the calf to face a predator's initial approach unprotected. This positioning is deliberate and consistent enough that wildlife researchers observing predator encounters near calving sites describe it as a reliable, almost predictable behavioral pattern. The cow placing herself squarely in harm's outweigh, while directing the calf often through vocal cues or physical nudging toward denser cover or a retreat path away from the immediate danger. This kind of protective positioning carries real physical risk for the cow, since standing her ground against a wolf pack or a curious bear means accepting the possibility of injury that could otherwise be avoided through simple flight. Yet the behavior persists reliably across observed encounters, suggesting a deeply ingrained maternal instinct that prioritizes the calf's survival even at meaningful cost to the cow's own safety. This willingness to physically interpose herself between danger and offspring helps explain much of the aggressive defensive behavior documented earlier, since a cow operating under this instinct treats any approaching threat, whether a genuine predator or simply an unaware hiker, according to the same basic protective calculus herself, first the calf's safety above all else. Single calves are common among moose, but twins occur frequently enough, particularly among cows in good body condition with access to abundant forage, that doubling up on offspring represents a genuine and recurring challenge rather than a rare exception. Raising twin calves effectively doubles the defensive burden placed on a single cow during those critical first weeks. Since both calves require protection, guidance, and constant awareness while moving at the pace of the slower or less coordinated of the pair, inevitably shapes how quickly the small family group can relocate away from danger. Researchers studying moose reproductive success have found that twin calves face measurably higher mortality rates than single calves, a pattern directly tied to this divided attention and the practical difficulty of shielding two vulnerable young animals simultaneously against predators, perfectly willing to exploit exactly that kind of split focus. Despite this added risk, twinning remains an evolutionarily favored strategy under the right conditions, since a cow in strong physical condition, with sufficient fat reserves and access to quality forage, stands a reasonable chance of successfully raising both calves through to independence, effectively doubling her reproductive output in a single season, compared to cows that produce only one calf. This trade-off between risk and reward plays out differently depending on regional food availability and predator density, meaning twinning rates themselves can serve as a useful indirect indicator of overall habitat quality within a given moose population. As autumn arrives and the rutting season begins in earnest, bull moose shift from their usual relative silence into producing deep, resonant grunting calls, vocalizations pitched low enough to travel remarkable distances through the quiet, sound-carrying stillness of a northern forest in early fall. These calls serve a clear reproductive purpose, announcing a bull's presence and location to any receptive cows within range, while simultaneously signaling to rival bulls that this particular stretch of forest is already claimed by a competitor worth taking seriously. The low frequency of these grunts is not incidental. Deeper, lower-pitched sounds travel further and degrade less over distance than higher-pitched calls, making this vocal register a practical choice for an animal trying to broadcast its presence across a wide, densely forested territory. Wildlife researchers recording moose vocalizations during rutting season have documented these calls carrying well over half a mile under ideal conditions, calm air, minimal wind interference, allowing a single bull's grunt to reach far beyond what visual signals alone could ever accomplish in dense forest terrain. This vocal behavior stands in sharp contrast to the bull's usual quiet, solitary demeanor through the rest of the year, one more example of how completely the rutting season reshapes a moose's normal patterns, transforming a typically reserved animal into one actively working to make its presence known across as much territory as its voice can reach. A bull's grunt rarely goes unanswered for long during peak rutting season, since cows entering estrus produce their own distinctive vocalization, a long, drawn-out wailing call, quite different in tone and structure from the bull's shorter, deeper grunts. This call serves the same basic broadcasting function in reverse, announcing a cow's reproductive readiness across considerable distance and effectively drawing bulls toward her location rather than requiring her to seek them out directly. The exchange between these two distinct calls, a bull's grunt answered by a cow's wail, creates something researchers have described as a kind of long-distance courtship dialogue playing out across the forest, each call prompting a response that gradually narrows the physical distance between two animals that may have started the exchange separated by a considerable stretch of dense terrain. This vocal courtship carries obvious practical advantages for both parties, since moose exist at relatively low population densities across most of their range, making the ability to locate a potential mate across distance rather than relying purely on chance encounters a genuinely valuable reproductive strategy. Wildlife biologists studying rutting behavior have noted that cows appear to time their calling with some deliberateness, often vocalizing most actively during the specific window of peak fertility, maximizing the chances that a responding bull arrives precisely when the opportunity for successful breeding is highest. It is a system built entirely around sound, remarkably effective across a landscape where visual contact between scattered individuals often proves impossible to rely on. Before any physical contest actually begins, two rival bulls encountering each other during rutting season typically engage in an extended period of visual assessment, circling, posturing, and displaying their antlers from various angles in what amounts to a careful mutual evaluation of relative size and strength. This sizing up phase serves an important practical function, allowing both bulls the opportunity to gauge whether an actual physical contest is likely to end favorably before committing to the genuine risk of injury that comes with locking antlers against a similarly matched opponent. Researchers observing rutting behavior have documented this assessment phase unfolding with surprising consistency, bulls positioning themselves broadside to display the full width and mass of their antler spread, sometimes accompanied by exaggerated, stiff-legged walking that emphasizes overall body size alongside the antlers themselves. This visual negotiation frequently resolves the contest before any physical clash occurs at all, since a clearly smaller or less impressively antlered bull will often simply withdraw once the size disparity becomes evident, avoiding an unnecessary and potentially injurious fight against an opponent unlikely to be defeated anyway. Only when two bulls appear genuinely comparable in size and antler development does the confrontation typically escalate toward actual physical combat, meaning the vast majority of rutting season disputes are settled through this careful visual calculation rather than outright violence, a system that spares both animals the serious risk that direct antler combat inevitably carries. When visual assessment fails to settle a dispute between two closely matched bulls, the resulting physical confrontation, while genuinely dramatic to witness, follows a surprisingly ritualized pattern rather than devolving into an uncontrolled fight aimed at seriously injuring or killing the ponds. Opponent. Two bulls will lock antlers directly, engaging in a sustained pushing and shoving contest that tests raw strength and stamina far more than it relies on the kind of goring or stabbing motions that would characterize a genuinely lethal confrontation. This ritualized structure serves an important evolutionary purpose, since a species that regularly killed or seriously maimed its own rutting-age males would face a significant, self-inflicted reduction in future breeding capacity, an outcome natural selection has clearly worked against over countless generations. The pushing contest typically continues until one bull, through sheer exhaustion or a clear disadvantage in leverage and strength, disengages and withdraws, conceding the contest without either animal suffering catastrophic injury in the process. Injuries do occur on occasion. Antlers can become genuinely tangled and exhausted. Bulls have been known to sustain real physical harm during particularly evenly matched contests. But these outcomes represent the exception rather than the intended design of the behavior. The system as a whole functions as a relatively safe, if physically demanding, method for determining which bull earns the breeding opportunity, channeling genuine competitive drive into a contest built around survival for both participants, rather than destruction of one by the other. Perhaps the most efficient outcome of any rutting season confrontation is the one that never actually escalates to physical contact at all. A dominant bull winning simply on the strength of appearing larger, more confident, and more physically imposing than a rival who chooses to withdraw before any real contest begins. This outcome represents the ideal case from an evolutionary standpoint, since it allows the more genuinely dominant animal to secure breeding access without expending the significant energy reserves that a full physical confrontation would demand. Energy a bull desperately needs to conserve, given how little he eats during the intensity of rutting season. Size alone does not tell the whole story either, since confidence, posture, and the sheer commitment with which a bull displays himself all factor into how convincingly he communicates dominance to a potential rival. A bull who postures with genuine conviction, holding his ground and displaying without hesitation, can sometimes discourage a slightly larger but less assertive rival simply through the strength of that display alone. This dynamic rewards more than raw physical size. It rewards the overall package of size, health, and confident bearing that together signal genuine competitive strength. For a species where breeding season success directly determines reproductive output for the year, this efficient, low-cost method of settling disputes offers a clear survival advantage, preserving energy and physical condition that dominant bulls will need to carry them through the difficult winter months, waiting just beyond the rut's conclusion. During rutting season, bull moose engage in a behavior that looks at first glance almost undignified for an animal of such imposing size, digging shallow pits or wallows in soft ground, then urinating within them and rolling or standing in the resulting mixture of mud and scent. Unappealing as this might sound to a human observer, the behavior serves a genuinely important reproductive function, since the strong scent left behind in these wallows plays a significant role in attracting cows during the breeding season. functioning almost like a calling card, advertising a bull's presence and reproductive readiness to any female moving through the area. Cows have been observed actively investigating these wallows, and some biologists believe the specific scent composition may communicate information about a bull's overall health and hormonal status details a cow could use consciously or not in evaluating potential mates. This wallowing behavior typically intensifies as the rut approaches its peak, with bulls returning to the same wallow repeatedly or creating several across a defended territory, effectively marking the landscape with scent in a way that extends a bull's presence well beyond wherever he happens to be standing at any given moment. It stands as one more example of how completely the rutting season reorganizes a bull's priorities and behavior, an animal that spends most of the year in quiet, solitary browsing suddenly investing real time and effort into a strategy built entirely around scent territory and the pursuit of reproductive opportunity. Across their home range, individual moose frequently follow the same specific travel routes, repeatedly wearing paths into the forest floor through consistent use that can over time come to resemble something close to a maintained hiking trail, rather than the random wandering one might expect from a wild animal moving through unmarked terrain. Researchers studying moose movement using tracking collars and direct field observation have documented this pattern extensively. Individual animals returning to the same narrow travel corridors between key resources, feeding areas, water sources, and bedding sites, session after session, season after season. These well-worn paths likely reflect the same practical calculation discussed earlier regarding route selection. An efficient path, once identified and proven reliable, becomes worth repeating rather than reinventing, particularly in terrain as physically demanding as the dense, often swampy boreal forest moose typically inhabit. Local hunters and outdoorsmen in moose country have long recognized and made practical use of these established trails, sometimes indistinguishable at a glance from a path cleared by human hands, a testament to just how consistently these routes get used over time. This behavior offers a small but genuinely revealing window into the underlying structure of a moose's seemingly solitary, wandering existence, suggesting instead an animal operating according to a fairly consistent internal map, one built through repeated experience and reinforced through the simple, practical logic of sticking with a route that has already proven itself reliable. The wallows and scent marks a bull moose leaves behind during rutting season do not simply evaporate within hours of being created, and a moose's remarkably sensitive nose can detect and interpret scent traces left behind by a rival bull days after that animal has actually moved on from the area. This extended scent detection window means bulls are effectively reading a kind of delayed message board scattered across their territory, gathering information about which rivals have recently passed through, how strong or established their presence seems to be without ever needing direct visual or physical contact to gather that intelligence. Researchers studying moose olfactory capability believe this extended scent reading ability plays a meaningful role in how bulls assess competition across a broader territory than they could ever cover through direct patrol alone, essentially outsourcing part of their territorial awareness to scent markers that persist and communicate long after the bull who left them has departed. This capability adds another layer of sophistication to the seemingly simple wallowing behavior described earlier, transforming what might look like a crude marking system into something closer to an ongoing asynchronous communication network running quietly across the forest throughout rutting season. For a species that spends most of the year deliberately solitary, this scent-based awareness of rivals and potential mates offers a practical solution to a fundamental challenge, staying informed about a landscape's social dynamics without ever needing to sacrifice the general preference for a mostly independent, unaccompanied existence. Surviving temperatures that regularly plunge well below freezing for extended stretches requires more than simply a warm coat, and moose have developed a physiological adaptation that allows them to selectively reduce blood flow to their legs during the coldest conditions, conserving precious core body heat for vital organs at the expense of maintaining full warmth throughout the extremities. This process, sometimes described as a controlled reduction in peripheral circulation, allows a moose's legs to operate at a noticeably cooler temperature than its core, without suffering the kind of tissue damage that would result from similarly reduced blood flow in a human limb exposed to comparable cold. The system works because moose leg tissue has adapted specifically to tolerate these lower temperatures safely, a specialized circulatory arrangement that essentially treats the legs as a zone where some warmth can be sacrificed without risking the animal's overall survival. This adaptation proves especially valuable given how much time a moose spends standing in snow wading through icy water, or bedding down directly on frozen ground conditions that would rapidly chill and endanger the legs of an animal without this specific circulatory safeguard in place. Researchers studying cold weather physiology across northern mammals point to this kind of selective circulation control as a recurring evolutionary solution, appearing in various forms across several species that share the challenge of surviving extreme cold, though the specific tolerances and mechanisms involved in moose remain an area of ongoing physiological study. The same dense hollow-haired coat that makes a moose so remarkably well suited to brutal winter cold becomes a genuine liability once temperatures climb, and moose show clear behavioral adjustments on warm days specifically because that insulation traps heat just as effectively in July as it does in January. Once temperatures rise into a range most people would consider entirely pleasant, moose actively seek out shade, cool water, or simply reduce activity levels, avoiding the kind of sustained movement or feeding effort that would risk pushing their body temperature into genuinely dangerous territory. This heat sensitivity explains a pattern familiar to anyone who has spent real time observing moose through summer. Animals that seem far more active and visible during the cooler hours of early morning and evening, retreating to shaded cover or standing partially submerged in ponds through the hottest stretch of a summer afternoon. Wildlife biologists studying moose thermal regulation have found that this heat avoidance behavior intensifies considerably during unusually warm stretches, with moose reducing overall daily activity and feeding time significantly once temperatures exceed a certain threshold. A pattern with real implications discussed later regarding how a warming climate affects moose populations across the southern edge of their range. It stands as a clear reminder that the same adaptation solving one problem, surviving extreme cold, can create a genuinely different problem entirely. Once environmental conditions shift in the opposite direction, an animal magnificently equipped for winter finding itself on the hottest days of summer, working actively against its own excellent insulation. Anyone who spots a moose panting on a hot summer day might reasonably assume the animal is exhausted or in some kind of distress, but this behavior actually reflects a normal functional temperature regulation strategy rather than a sign that something has gone genuinely wrong. Panting allows a moose to increase heat loss through rapid evaporation across the moist tissue of the mouth and respiratory passages, a cooling mechanism that becomes particularly important given how effectively that same animal's coat traps heat close to the body during warmer weather. This distinction matters for anyone observing moose behavior in the field, since panting on its own, absent other signs of genuine distress like stumbling, unusual lethargy, or visible injury, typically indicates nothing more than an animal actively managing its body temperature through entirely ordinary physiological means. Wildlife researchers studying thermal stress in moose populations use panting frequency and duration as one useful indicator of how effectively a given individual or population is coping with rising summer temperatures, tracking changes in this behavior as a practical measure of thermal strain across different regions and seasons. Understanding this distinction carries real value beyond simple curiosity too, since it helps explain why moose in warmer, more southern portions of their range show measurably different behavioral patterns than populations further north. An adaptation to genuine environmental pressure rather than a sign of individual animals in some kind of ongoing crisis every time a summer afternoon happens to grow warm. When a moose settles down to rest, the choice of where exactly to bed down reflects considerably more calculation than simple convenience or the nearest available patch of shade. Researchers observing moose bedding behavior have documented a consistent pattern of site selection, weighing several practical factors at once: wind direction relative to potential predator approach, the density and type of surrounding cover, and critically, the availability of a clear escape route should danger appear while the animal is resting and therefore momentarily vulnerable. Positioning downwind or crosswind from likely predator approach paths allows a moose's excellent sense of smell to serve as an early warning system even while bedded, extending the same olfactory vigilance relied upon during active movement into moments of rest as well. The escape route consideration proves equally important, since a moose surprised while lying down needs a clear, unobstructed path to rise and move quickly, meaning bedding sites tend to avoid terrain that would trap or significantly slow the animal during that critical first moment of a startled departure. This careful site selection process happens repeatedly throughout a moose's daily routine, since the animal typically beds down multiple times across a single day to rest and process food through rumination, each instance representing a fresh, deliberate assessment of the immediate surroundings rather than a single fixed choice made once and simply repeated without further thought. Beyond simple shade seeking on individual hot days, some moose populations have shown a broader, more sustained shift in their overall daily activity, rhythm adjusting feeding and movement patterns to concentrate activity during cooler morning and evening hours, while reducing activity almost entirely through the hottest stretch of midday, particularly as regional summer temperatures have trended warmer over recent decades. This represents a more significant behavioral adaptation than simple opportunistic shade seeking, reflecting instead a genuine restructuring of how a population organizes its daily routine around the specific thermal challenges of its particular environment. Researchers tracking moose activity patterns across different latitudes have found measurable differences in how pronounced this shift becomes, with populations in warmer, more southern portions of the moose's range showing more dramatic activity, compression around cooler hours compared to populations further north where summer heat poses a comparatively smaller challenge. This kind of behavioral flexibility offers some genuine adaptive value, allowing moose populations to continue functioning even as regional climate conditions shift. Though researchers studying long-term population trends caution that behavioral adjustment alone may not fully offset the cumulative physiological stress that comes with an animal so thoroughly built for cold, increasingly having to manage warmer conditions across a growing portion of the year. This pattern connects directly to broader questions about moose range and population health explored later, since sustained thermal stress carries consequences that extend well beyond simple daily activity timing. The vocal recognition documented earlier, a calf learning to distinguish its own mother's grunt, runs in both directions, and cow moose demonstrate an equally reliable ability to recognize their own calf-specific call apart from other calves that might be vocalizing nearby. A genuinely useful skill in situations where multiple cow-calf pairs occupy overlapping territory during the same general period. This mutual recognition system becomes particularly valuable during moments of separation or confusion. A calf temporarily out of sight in dense brush or multiple family groups converging near the same feeding area. Situations where relying purely on general vocalization without individual recognition could easily lead a cow toward the wrong calf entirely. Researchers studying maternal behavior in moose have documented cows responding specifically and immediately to their own calf's distress or contact calls, while showing comparatively little reaction to similar vocalizations from unrelated calves nearby. Evidence of a genuine auditory discrimination system operating reliably even under the kind of environmental noise and competing sound that dense forest terrain regularly produces. This bidirectional recognition, mother and calf each capable of distinguishing the other's voice from the general soundscape, represents a relatively sophisticated communication system for an animal, often characterized primarily through its size and physical presence rather than its cognitive or sensory subtlety. A reminder that the less visible aspects of moose behavior often prove just as remarkable as anything happening at the level of raw physical scale. Taken together, the behaviors gathered across this stretch, precise navigation shaped by memory and environmental reading, mutual vocal recognition between mother and calf, ritualized combat that favors calculated assessment over reckless violence, and a rutting season built almost entirely around long-distance communication rather than chance encounter, paint a picture considerably more sophisticated than the popular image of a moose as a simple lumbering forest giant. What emerges instead is an animal operating according to patience and calculation nearly as often as raw physical force, weighing risk before committing to confrontation, remembering specific locations across years, and maintaining communication systems finely tuned to the exact challenges of a solitary existence spread across dense, visually limited terrain. None of this diminishes the very real danger and physical power documented earlier. Rather, it adds necessary context, revealing that the same animal capable of shattering a wolf's skull with a single kick is equally capable of quietly, deliberately choosing to withdraw from an unnecessary fight, or returning with striking precision to the exact patch of wetland where a calf was successfully raised the year before. This blend of raw capability and genuine behavioral sophistication sets the stage for what comes next, moving from intelligence and behavior toward the sheer scale of what a moose's life actually involves: growth. Size and numbers substantial enough to leave even a well-informed observer genuinely stunned by the scope of it all. A newborn moose calf arrives weighing somewhere around 25 to 35 pounds, already a substantial size compared to the young of most other North American mammals, and yet that considerable birth weight represents only a beginning of a growth trajectory so rapid it borders on difficult to fully believe. Within the first few weeks of life, a healthy calf can gain roughly that same amount all over again, effectively doubling its birth weight in a startlingly short window, fueled by rich maternal milk, and before long an increasingly aggressive appetite for the vegetation surrounding it. This growth rate reflects the same underlying evolutionary pressure discussed earlier. A newborn calf facing serious predation risk throughout its early vulnerable weeks, meaning rapid size gain translates directly into improved odds of survival. A bigger, stronger calf simply presenting a more difficult and less appealing target for a wolf or bear assessing an opportunity. Wildlife biologists tracking calf development describe this early growth phase as one of the most physically demanding periods in a cow's own life, as well, since sustaining the milk production necessary to fuel that pace of growth requires the mother to consume enormous quantities of forage, herself often, while still recovering physically from the demands of birth. What results is a genuinely remarkable partnership. Mother and calf both pushing their bodies towards specific urgent biological goals, hers focused on milk production, the calf's on rapid protective growth, working in tandem against a landscape that offers very little patience for vulnerability. Continue tracking that growth curve forward, and the numbers become genuinely difficult to reconcile with the image of a small, wobbly newborn taking its first uncertain steps just months earlier. By around 5 months of age, a moose calf can weigh close to 400 pounds, a figure that places a young animal still nursing and still learning the basic rhythms of forest life, already well beyond the adult weight of many fully grown large mammals found across North America. This pace of growth ranks among the fastest documented in any land mammal, a trajectory that essentially compresses what might take other species years into a single active growing season, stretching from spring birth through autumn. Achieving this kind of growth requires an almost constant cycle of feeding and rest, a calf spending a considerable portion of each day, either nursing, browsing on increasingly substantial vegetation, or resting to process the sheer volume of nutrition its rapidly developing body demands. Wildlife researchers studying calf development note that this accelerated timeline serves a clear, practical purpose, beyond simply outgrowing predator vulnerability, since a calf entering its first winter needs sufficient size and fat reserves to survive months of scarce food and brutal cold without the benefit of its mother's milk to fall back on. That 400-pound milestone reached in less than half a year represents not simply an impressive statistic, but a genuine survival requirement, a race against the calendar that every moose calf runs from the very first day of its life. To make sense of just how extraordinary this growth pace actually is, consider it against a familiar human benchmark. A moose calf gaining roughly its own birth weight again within a few weeks, and continuing that trajectory toward hundreds of pounds by autumn translates roughly into an animal packing on the equivalent weight of a grown adult man over the bid. Course of just a handful of weeks, repeated again and again across a single growing season. No human diet or exercise regimen could remotely replicate that pace of growth, nor would it be physically survivable for a person to attempt it. But for a moose calf, this astonishing rate represents entirely ordinary expected development, rather than any kind of biological anomaly. This comparison helps clarify why moose calves require such an intensive feeding schedule throughout their first months, since supporting this kind of sustained, rapid tissue and skeletal growth demands a caloric intake that would seem almost impossible to sustain without the specific combination of rich maternal milk early on and an increasingly aggressive appetite for high-quality forage as the calf matures. It also helps explain the urgency behind so much of the maternal protective behavior documented earlier, since a cow is not simply guarding a small, vulnerable animal. In the abstract, she is protecting an active, ongoing biological project, consuming tremendous resources and racing against a hard seasonal deadline before winter arrives, and growth must out of necessity slow considerably. The antler growth, described earlier as occurring at nearly an inch a day, translates across a full summer season into a truly substantial amount of new bone material, with a mature bull capable of regrowing a complete antler set weighing up to 40 pounds, constructed entirely from scratch within the span of a single growing season. This represents one of the fastest rates of bone growth documented anywhere in the animal kingdom, a biological feat made all the more remarkable by the fact that this entire structure will be shed and discarded just months later, only to be rebuilt again from nothing the following spring. Producing 40 pounds of new bone in a matter of months requires an enormous investment of calcium, phosphorus, and protein nutrients. A bull must extract almost entirely from summer vegetation, making the quality and abundance of available forage during these months directly relevant to how large and impressive that season's antlers ultimately grow. Wildlife biologists studying antler development have found a clear, measurable correlation between habitat quality and antler size across different moose populations, with bulls in nutrient-rich environments consistently producing larger, heavier racks than those contending with poorer forage availability. This connection between environment and antler mass makes antler size a genuinely useful indicator for researchers assessing overall habitat health across a given moose range, a visible, measurable signal of underlying ecological conditions, written directly onto the head of every mature bull each and every year. 40 pounds is a figure easy to state but harder to genuinely picture, so consider it against something more immediately familiar. Regrowing that much antler bone in a single summer is roughly comparable to a bull moose reconstructing the total bone mass of a large dog, a full-grown Labrador Retriever or German Shepherd entirely from scratch every single year, only to discard the entire structure again a few months later and repeat the whole process the following spring. Framed this way, the sheer scale of what a bull moose accomplishes each summer becomes considerably easier to appreciate, an enormous biological undertaking that most people encountering only the finished antlers on a mounted trophy or a photograph rarely stop to consider in terms of the raw material and metabolic effort actually required to produce them. This yearly cycle of construction and disposal represents a genuinely unusual evolutionary strategy, since almost no other mammal invests this heavily in growing and then completely discarding such a substantial quantity of bone tissue on an annual basis. The practical payoff, a fresh, undamaged set of antlers each rutting season, rather than a permanently attached structure that would accumulate wear, injury, and asymmetry over multiple years, apparently justifies the tremendous metabolic cost involved. It stands as one of the more genuinely staggering examples of biological investment found anywhere in the deer family, a full dog's worth of bone built and discarded every single year of a bull's adult life. The geographic reach of the moose extends across a genuinely impressive stretch of the northern hemisphere, spanning 2 continents entirely from the dense forests of Maine and the broader northeastern United States across Canada's vast boreal expanse through Alaska, and continuing on the other side of the globe, through Scandinavia's forests and fjords deep into Russia's expansive taiga. Few large land mammals maintain a natural range covering this much territory, a distribution that reflects just how well moose biology, cold tolerance, aquatic feeding ability, deep snow mobility suits the specific conditions found across the entire northern boreal and subarctic zone, regardless of which continent that zone happens to fall on. This wide range does come with regional variation, and moose in Scandinavia and Russia, sometimes classified as a slightly different subspecies from their North American counterparts, show some differences in size and antler configuration, though the fundamental biology and behavior remain remarkably consistent across the entire range. The presence of moose across such geographically distant and culturally distinct regions has shaped the animal's relationship with humans quite differently depending on location, a subsistence resource for indigenous communities in North America, a significant traditional hunting quarry across Scandinavia, and a species that has in various places and various eras been the subject of everything from careful conservation management to attempted domestication. Standing at either end of that vast range, a hunter in rural Maine and a forester in northern Norway are in a very real sense contending with the same remarkable animal. Within North America alone, wildlife agencies estimate a total moose population numbering in the hundreds of thousands, distributed unevenly across Alaska, Canada, and the northern reaches of the lower 48 states. A population substantial enough to support regulated hunting seasons across much of that range, while still requiring careful ongoing management in regions facing more significant ecological pressure. This overall population figure represents a genuine conservation success story in several respects, since moose numbers in parts of their range, particularly the northeastern United States, had declined significantly by the early 20th century due to unregulated hunting and habitat loss, only to rebound substantially over subsequent decades through a combination of hunting regulation, habitat protection, and natural population recovery. Once those pressures eased, that recovery has not proven uniform across the entire range, however, and some regional populations, particularly toward the southern edge of moose habitat, have faced renewed decline in more recent decades due to factors explored later, rising temperatures and expanding tick populations chief among them. The overall North American figure, hundreds of thousands of individual moose spread across an enormous geographic range, reflects both the genuine resilience of the species and the ongoing vulnerability that comes with an animal so specifically adapted to cold climate conditions, increasingly under pressure from a warming world. Wildlife agencies continue monitoring these populations closely, tracking regional trends that vary considerably depending on local habitat conditions, predator populations, and the specific climate pressures each particular region happens to be experiencing. Sustaining a body of this scale and fueling growth rates as dramatic as those documented in calves and antlers alike requires a genuinely enormous daily intake of vegetation, enough that a single adult moose feeding steadily through a day could realistically strip bare the equivalent of a small backyard orchard, branches, twigs, and available leaves consumed at a pace few people would expect from watching the animal's typically unhurried, deliberate feeding style. This voracious appetite reflects the sheer metabolic demand of maintaining such an enormous body, particularly for a herbivore relying on browse twigs, bark, and leaves. that offers considerably less caloric density than the grain or grass diet available to many other large mammals. Anyone who has planted young fruit trees or ornamental shrubs in moose country understands this appetite in painfully direct personal terms, since a moose wandering through a rural property overnight can leave behind a scene of genuine devastation, branches stripped clean, bark gouged, an entire season of careful gardening undone before breakfast the next morning. Wildlife extension offices in moose-heavy states field regular calls from frustrated property owners looking for guidance on protecting young trees, offering advice ranging from fencing to specific plant selections known to hold less appeal for a browsing moose. It stands as one of the more relatable, if occasionally frustrating, points of contact between this enormous wild animal and the everyday rhythms of rural life, a reminder that feeding an animal this size leaves a visible mark on the landscape it moves through. Quantify that daily appetite precisely, and the number itself is striking. An adult moose capable of consuming over 50 pounds of vegetation across a single day, a volume of intake that reflects both the animal's enormous body mass and the comparatively low caloric density of the twigs, bark, leafy browse that make up the bulk of its diet through much of the year. Reaching that 50-pound figure requires a moose to spend a substantial portion of each day actively feeding, often moving steadily through its territory while browsing continuously, rather than settling into one spot and consuming everything available before moving on. A foraging strategy that spreads impact across a wider area of forest, rather than concentrating damage in any single location. This feeding pattern shifts somewhat by season too, with the nutrient-rich aquatic plants available in summer offering a denser caloric return than the woody winter browse. A moose relies on once ponds freeze over and softer vegetation disappears beneath snow. Wildlife biologists studying moose foraging behavior have found that meeting this daily intake requirement becomes considerably more difficult during harsh winters, when snow depth limits access to browse and the caloric quality of available food drops significantly compared to summer's more varied and nutrient-dense options. This daily feeding demand explains a great deal about moose behavior, discussed throughout this account: the near-constant movement, the careful seasonal migration between feeding grounds, and the sheer volume of forest resources. A healthy moose population requires simply to sustain itself through an ordinary year. 50 pounds of vegetation is another figure that benefits from translation into something more immediately graspable. And the comparison researchers sometimes reach for involves bread, an everyday staple familiar to nearly everyone. Consuming 50 pounds of food in a single day would be roughly equivalent in terms of sheer volume to a person eating several dozen loaves of bread over the course of that same day, an amount that immediately clarifies just how substantial a moose's daily feeding requirement actually is when measured against something genuinely familiar rather than left as an abstract number. No person could realistically manage anything close to that volume of intake, of course. But the comparison helps illustrate the sheer physical scale of what a moose accomplishes through routine, daily browsing work that from a distance might look like nothing more than an animal wandering slowly through the trees quietly, methodically pulling leaves and twigs with little visible urgency. That deceptive calm masks an enormous, ongoing metabolic project, an animal working continuously, simply to sustain a body built on the scale documented throughout this account. From the antlers regrown each summer to the muscle and bone required to carry 1,500 pounds through deep snow and across open lakes. Understanding this daily feeding volume adds real context to the earlier fact about backyard devastation too, since what looks like a single moose stripping a modest orchard overnight represents only a fraction of what that same animal will consume before the day fully concludes. The intense nursing relationship that begins at birth and fuels those first astonishing weeks of rapid weight gain does not continue indefinitely. And moose calves are typically weaned by early autumn, a transition occurring within just a handful of months after birth, despite the calf's near total dependence on its mother's milk through those critical early weeks of life. This relatively compressed nursing period reflects the broader compressed timeline running throughout a moose's early development, since a calf needs to transition toward independent solid food foraging well before winter arrives. And the mother's own physical condition, drained considerably by months of milk production, requires her full attention shift toward building her own fat reserves ahead of the season's harshest stretch. By the time weaning occurs, a calf has typically developed sufficient size and foraging competence to manage this transition successfully, having spent the preceding weeks gradually supplementing milk with an increasing intake of solid vegetation, a natural, incremental shift rather than an abrupt cutoff. This weaning timeline also connects directly to the cow's own reproductive cycle, since a cow needs to redirect her physical resources toward her own recovery and preparation well before the following spring's rut and potential new pregnancy places renewed demands on her body. The entire arrangement reflects a tightly coordinated seasonal rhythm. Birth in spring, intensive nursing through early summer, gradual weaning by autumn, each stage timed precisely against the broader calendar that governs nearly every aspect of a moose's annual life cycle. Just as weaning arrives on a compressed timeline, so too does the broader transition toward full independence, and a young moose typically finds itself actively pushed away from its mother, roughly a year after birth timing that lines up directly with the cow's preparation to give birth again the following spring. This separation is not gradual or passive. Cows have been documented actively driving away their own yearling offspring, sometimes with genuine physical insistence, as the time for a new calf's arrival approaches, a clear signal that the maternal investment of the previous year has effectively concluded and attention must now shift entirely toward the next generation. For the yearling on the receiving end of this rejection, the transition marks a genuinely significant life shift, moving from a protected, guided existence alongside an experienced adult toward an independent life navigating territory, food sources, and predator avoidance, largely on its own for the first time. This timing reflects the same underlying logic found throughout moose reproductive biology, a system built around annual cycles that leave little room for extended parental investment beyond what each specific calf genuinely requires to reach basic self-sufficiency. Wildlife biologists studying this transition note that yearlings pushed away in this manner generally possess sufficient size, foraging skill, and survival instinct to manage independently, the preceding year having provided exactly enough guidance and protection to prepare them for a life that from this point forward they will navigate almost entirely alone. Once a cow moose reaches reproductive maturity, she typically settles into an annual rhythm of giving birth each spring, a cycle repeated year after year with relatively little pause, assuming adequate body condition and sufficient forage availability to support the tremendous physical demands each successive pregnancy and nursing period requires. This consistent annual reproduction stands in contrast to some other large mammal species that space births further apart, and it reflects the relatively short overall lifespan and compressed reproductive window available to a moose, compared to longer-lived species that can afford a more gradual approach to producing offspring across their lifetime. Maintaining this pace places real, ongoing demands on a cow's body, since each cycle, pregnancy, birth, intensive, nursing, weaning, and the eventual push toward yearling independence draws heavily on physical reserves that must then be rebuilt before the following year's cycle begins again. Cows in particularly poor body condition, whether due to habitat quality, harsh winter conditions, or advancing age, may occasionally skip a breeding season entirely, redirecting limited resources towards simple survival rather than reproduction. A pragmatic biological adjustment that wildlife biologists use as one useful indicator of overall population health across a given region. For a cow in good condition, though, this near-annual cycle continues reliably across much of her adult life. An ongoing, repeated commitment to producing and raising new calves that defines much of what her yearly existence actually involves. While a bull moose begins growing antlers as early as his second year of life, the truly massive, fully developed rack most people associate with a mature bull does not appear immediately, requiring instead several years of accumulating growth, physical maturity, and increasing access to quality forage before reaching its full potential size and configuration. Each successive year typically brings a somewhat larger, more elaborately branched set of antlers than the year before, a gradual progression that generally peaks once a bull reaches full physical maturity, usually somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 years of age, depending on individual health and environmental conditions. This extended developmental timeline means the most impressive antlers within any given moose population tend to belong specifically to bulls in this particular prime age range. Animals old enough to have accumulated the necessary physical development and nutritional resources, but not yet declining, into the reduced antler size that often accompanies advanced age. Wildlife biologists studying antler development across a bull's lifetime describe this pattern as a genuinely useful indicator of both individual health and overall age structure within a population, since antler size alone can offer researchers meaningful information about a given bull's place within that broader developmental timeline. This gradual, multi-year progression toward peak antler size adds another layer of context to the rapid summer regrowth documented earlier. Since even though each individual season's antlers grow entirely from scratch, the overall trajectory across a bull's life still follows its own distinct, accumulating pattern of growth and eventual decline. The absolute largest antler spans ever documented among moose stretch beyond 6 feet from tip to tip. A measurement that laid against a grown man standing with arms fully extended actually exceeds the reach most people could manage with their own outstretched wingspan. This kind of exceptional size represents the upper extreme of moose antler development, typically achieved only by mature bulls in prime condition. Living in habitat with genuinely abundant high-quality forage, the specific combination of age, health, and environmental resources discussed as necessary for reaching peak antler potential. Record-sized antlers of this scale have been documented primarily in Alaska and parts of the Yukon, regions where certain moose populations tend to grow notably larger overall than their counterparts. Further south or across the Atlantic in Scandinavia, a pattern researchers attribute to a combination of genetics, forage availability, the specific environmental pressures found in that particular portion of the moose's range. Carrying antlers of this magnitude places real physical demands on a bull throughout the growing season, and the sheer weight involved, sometimes exceeding 60 or 70 pounds for a complete rack of this size, requires genuinely substantial neck and shoulder muscle to support and maneuver effectively, particularly during the physical demands of rutting season combat. Encountering a bull carrying antlers anywhere near this record scale leaves little room for doubt about the genuine, almost architectural scope of what a moose's body is capable of producing when conditions align favorably across every contributing factor at once. The story of moose populations across parts of their range includes a genuine conservation success, worth pausing on directly, since several regions that saw moose populations decline to near local extinction roughly a century ago have since witnessed dramatic recoveries, populations rebuilding from around small handful of remaining individuals back to healthy, sustainable numbers over subsequent decades. This pattern played out notably across parts of the northeastern United States, where unregulated hunting and significant habitat loss through the 1800s and early 1900s had pushed regional moose numbers to genuinely precarious lows, in some areas approaching complete local disappearance. The recovery that followed did not happen by accident, resulting instead from a deliberate combination of hunting, regulation, habitat protection efforts, and in some cases, the natural regrowth of forest land that had previously been cleared for agriculture, conditions that gradually restored the kind of mixed forest and wetland habitat moose require to thrive. Wildlife biologists studying this recovery describe it as one of the more genuinely encouraging examples of large mammal conservation in North America, a species that came remarkably close to disappearing from significant portions of its historic range. Now, once again, a familiar, if still carefully managed presence across much of that same territory. This history carries real weight against the more recent population pressures explored ahead, since it demonstrates the species' genuine capacity for recovery under the right conditions, even as newer challenges now test that resilience in different, less straightforward ways. Building directly on that broader recovery story, the specific case of the northeastern United States offers a particularly clear illustration of how deliberate conservation policy translated into genuine, measurable population rebound. States including Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, each home to moose populations that had dwindled dramatically by the early 20th century, implemented hunting regulations and habitat protections over subsequent decades that gradually allowed local populations to rebuild, aided considerably by the natural reforestation of land that had previously been cleared for farming and then largely abandoned as regional agriculture shifted westward. Maine in particular now supports one of the largest moose populations found anywhere in the lower 48 states, a genuine turnaround from a period when the animal's presence in the state had grown genuinely uncertain. This recovery did not happen uniformly, or without ongoing management challenges, and wildlife agencies across the region continue monitoring population health closely, balancing regulated hunting seasons that support both ecological management and regional economic activity against the need to maintain genuinely sustainable population numbers. The reclaimed forest habitat supporting this recovery represents a particular kind of ecological patience. Decades of gradual regrowth, transforming former farmland back into the mixed forest and wetland conditions. Moose require a slow process that ultimately delivered a genuinely successful outcome for a species that within relatively recent historical memory had come close to disappearing from significant portions of a landscape it now once again calls home. Beyond simple population numbers, moose exert a genuine, measurable influence on the very structure of the forests they inhabit, and a healthy population feeding steadily across the same general territory over decades can meaningfully reshape a forest's understory, the layer of young trees, shrubs, and low vegetation growing beneath the main canopy. Sustained browsing pressure tends to suppress the growth of certain preferred food species, particularly young hardwood saplings and shrubs like willow and aspen. While less palatable, plant species face comparatively less pressure and can grow more freely in that same space, gradually shifting the overall composition of what grows beneath the forest canopy over an extended period. This influence positions moose as what ecologists sometimes call a keystone herbivore, an animal whose feeding behavior shapes conditions for countless other species, sharing that same habitat from smaller mammals relying on specific understory plants for food or cover, to the broader trajectory of forest regeneration following natural disturbances like fire or logging. Researchers studying long-term forest ecology in moose territory have documented measurable differences in understory composition between areas with healthy moose populations and comparable areas where moose numbers remain notably lower, evidence of just how significant this browsing pressure becomes when sustained consistently across enough time. This ecological role adds real depth to how moose fit within their broader environment, an animal whose daily feeding habits, driven simply by the need to sustain an enormous body, ultimately ripple outward to influence the fundamental structure of the forest itself. Step back now across the entire arc of growth traced throughout this account, and the transformation from a newborn calf weighing perhaps 25 or 30 pounds to a mature bull, eventually reaching 1,500 pounds, stands as one of the more genuinely dramatic size transformations found anywhere among large land mammals, a roughly 50-fold increase in body mass achieved across just a handful of years. Very few animals of comparable adult size undergo growth this rapid and this extreme relative to their starting point, and the compressed timeline involved dramatic weight gain within the first months, continued substantial growth through several subsequent years toward full physical maturity, reflects every pressure and priority documented throughout this account: predator vulnerability, driving urgency in early growth, seasonal deadlines, shaping nursing and weaning schedules, and the gradual multi-year accumulation required to reach full adult size and antler development. Considering this transformation as a single continuous arc rather than a series of isolated facts about calves, antlers, and adult weight considered separately, brings into focus just how thoroughly a moose's entire biology has been organized around the demands of rapid, purposeful growth. Very little about this process happens by accident or without clear evolutionary purpose, each stage calibrated precisely against the specific risks and opportunities a moose faces at that particular point in its life. What began as a vulnerable, wobbly-legged newborn standing for the first time within hours of birth ultimately becomes, given time and sufficient resources, one of the largest land mammals found anywhere across 2 entire continents. Statistics and comparisons can only carry an understanding so far, and people who have actually stood at a respectful distance from a full-grown bull moose for the first time consistently describe a similar reaction, a genuine, visceral surprise at just how much animal is actually standing in front of them, a scale that photographs and secondhand descriptions rarely manage to fully capture. The shoulder height alone, often exceeding 6 feet on a mature bull, places a moose's back at a level that would allow many adults to walk directly underneath without needing to duck, an image that tends to recalibrate expectations rather quickly for anyone who assumed they had a reasonably accurate mental picture of the animal beforehand. Add the antlers, often spanning several feet beyond even that already considerable shoulder height, and the overall silhouette becomes something that genuinely commands attention, a presence in the landscape difficult to mistake for anything else, sharing that same forest or wetland. This reaction surprise at true scale, despite prior familiarity with basic facts and figures, says something meaningful about the limits of statistics alone in conveying real understanding, a reminder that numbers on a page rarely translate fully into the actual felt experience of standing near something built on this scale. Having now traced the full arc from tiny, vulnerable newborn to this genuinely imposing adult presence, the account turns next toward the broader questions of what this remarkable animal means within its ecosystem, and what, even after all this, still remains genuinely unknown. Within the broader ecological fabric of the northern forest, the moose occupies a position of genuine consequence, standing as the largest browsing herbivore across most of the boreal and mixed forest ecosystems it inhabits, and through that position, quietly exerting real influence over which trees and shrubs manage to establish and flourish across a given stretch of territory. This influence operates gradually, rarely dramatic in any single moment, but cumulative over years and decades, as consistent browsing pressure on preferred species like young aspen, birch, and willow shapes the eventual composition of the forest that grows up around it. Ecologists studying northern forest dynamics increasingly recognize this kind of large herbivore browsing pressure as a genuinely foundational ecological force, comparable in its long-term structural influence to factors like fire or to wind throw, even though moose feeding produces none of the dramatic, immediately visible disturbance associated with those other forces. A forest with a healthy, sustained moose population over multiple decades often looks measurably different in its understory composition than a comparable forest, where moose pressure has been minimal or absent evidence of just how significant this quiet, steady influence becomes when given enough time to accumulate. This ecological role places the moose firmly within a category of species ecologists sometimes describe as foundational to their environment, an animal whose ordinary daily behavior, simply eating enough to sustain its own enormous body, ultimately helps determine the fundamental shape and character of the forest ecosystem surrounding it. Wetland environments in particular bear some of the clearest, most measurable marks of sustained moose browsing pressure since willow and aspen, two of the plant species moose favor most heavily, tend to concentrate specifically in the kind of pond edge and wetland habitat where moose spend so much of their time feeding, especially through the warmer months of the year. Consistent, heavy browsing on these species across multiple years can genuinely redirect how a wetland's vegetation structure develops, suppressing the growth of these particular preferred plants while allowing less palatable species to expand into that same available space, gradually shifting the overall character and composition of the wetland edge over an extended period. Researchers studying wetland ecology in regions with dense moose populations have documented this pattern, directly comparing wetland vegetation structure in areas with heavy moose use against similar wetlands experiencing less browsing pressure, finding measurable, consistent differences in plant composition tied directly to moose feeding intensity. This influence carries consequences that extend well beyond the moose itself too, since the specific vegetation structure that develops around a heavily browsed wetland affects countless other species relying on that same habitat, from nesting birds, favoring particular shrub densities, to smaller mammals dependent on specific plant cover for both food and protection. It stands as one more clear example of how an animal often understood primarily through its size and physical presence also functions as a genuine active architect of the specific ecosystems it moves through, reshaping wetland habitat gradually but consistently across the full span of years it spends feeding there. The relationship between moose and the predators, sharing their northern range, runs in both directions. And while adult moose present a genuinely formidable challenge for wolves and bears alike, moose calves represent a critically important food source for both predator species, particularly across the vulnerable weeks immediately following birth, before a calf reaches the size and speed necessary to meaningfully reduce its own predation risk. This predator-prey relationship positions moose as a genuine cornerstone species within the broader northern food web. Since the annual availability of vulnerable calves directly influences reproductive success and population stability for both wolf packs and bear populations, sharing that same territory, particularly in regions where alternative large prey species remain comparatively scarce. Researchers studying predator-prey dynamics in boreal ecosystems have documented clear correlations between calf survival rates in a given year and subsequent reproductive success among local wolf and bear populations, evidence of just how tightly interconnected these species' fates remain. Despite the very different roles each plays within the broader ecosystem, this dependency creates a genuinely complex ecological balance, since healthy predator populations require adequate calf availability to sustain themselves, while moose populations simultaneously depend on maintaining sufficient calf to survival to sustain their own numbers across successive generations. Attention wildlife managers must weigh carefully when considering population targets and hunting regulations affecting either species. The moose in this sense functions as something considerably more significant than simply one more large mammal moving through the northern forest, standing instead as a genuine linchpin holding together the broader predator-prey dynamics of the entire ecosystem it inhabits. Long before European settlement reshaped the landscape of North America, indigenous peoples across the northern reaches of the continent had already developed a deep, sustained relationship with the moose, relying on the animal as a critical resource, providing food, hide for clothing and shelter, and bone and antler material fashioned into tools, all drawn from a single successful hunt that could sustain a family or community across an extended period. This relationship extended well beyond simple subsistence and moose hunting practices. Seasonal knowledge and the careful, respectful use of every part of the animal harvested reflected generations of accumulated ecological understanding passed down through specific cultural traditions unique to different indigenous nations across the moose's North American range. Many of these traditions continue today, and moose remain a culturally and nutritionally significant resource for numerous indigenous communities across Canada and Alaska, with hunting rights and traditional practices often protected specifically through treaty agreements and ongoing legal frameworks recognizing this deep historical relationship. Wildlife biologists and conservation managers increasingly recognize the value of incorporating this generations deep traditional ecological knowledge alongside more recent scientific research, since indigenous communities often possess detailed, long term observational understanding of local moose population patterns and behavior extending back considerably further than formal wildlife science, has been actively tracking the species. This long, continuous relationship between indigenous peoples and moose stands as one of the more significant ongoing threads connecting this animal's biological story to a genuinely deep human history. A relationship measured not in decades, but in countless generations. Across the Atlantic, Scandinavia holds its own deep, long-standing relationship with the moose. One where autumn hunting has evolved into a genuinely significant cultural tradition passed down through generations of families in Sweden, Norway, and Finland, often involving entire communities, coordinating around the start of each region's carefully regulated hunting season. This tradition extends well beyond the simple practical matter of harvesting meat, and moose hunting in Scandinavia frequently carries real social and cultural weight, multi-generational family groups gathering annually for what amounts to a genuine seasonal ritual complete with established, shared knowledge passed from experienced hunters to newer generations, and a broader cultural narrative around the moose as a defining symbol of the northern forest landscape itself. Sweden alone manages one of the more substantial regulated moose hunts found anywhere in the world, with hunting quotas set annually based on careful population surveys designed to maintain a sustainable balance between honoring this deep cultural tradition and ensuring the long-term health of the regional moose population itself. This Scandinavian relationship with moose hunting offers an interesting parallel to the indigenous hunting traditions found across North America. Two entirely separate cultural contexts, developed independently across a vast ocean, both centering the same animal as a genuinely significant thread within their respective seasonal traditions and community identity. The moose, in this sense, occupies a rare position among wild animals, holding deep cultural significance simultaneously across two continents and multiple distinct human traditions that developed with little to no direct historical connection between them. In a genuinely unusual chapter of the moose's relationship with humans, Russian researchers spent decades attempting to domesticate the species, exploring the moose's potential as both a pack animal capable of navigating terrain too difficult for horses, and more surprisingly, as a source of dairy milk that might supplement traditional livestock in regions where conventional farming proved genuinely challenging. These efforts, conducted most notably at a dedicated moose farm established in the Soviet Union during the mid-20th century, involved raising moose from calves in controlled conditions, testing their tolerance for handling, harnessing, and the kind of repeated human interaction domestication generally requires. The pack animal experiments showed some genuine promise in specific applications, since a moose's long legs and natural ability to move efficiently through deep snow and difficult wetland terrain offered real theoretical advantages over horses in exactly the kind of remote, challenging landscape found across much of Russia's northern regions. Researchers also successfully milked moose during these experiments, discovering somewhat to their surprise that moose milk carried a notably rich nutritional profile compared to conventional dairy cattle. Though production volumes proved far too limited to ever support genuine commercial dairy operations at any meaningful scale. This unusual research program, part serious scientific inquiry and part genuinely ambitious experiment in reimagining which large mammals might serve practical human purposes, stands as one of the more surprising footnotes in the long, varied history of humans attempting to work directly alongside this remarkable animal. The nutritional richness of moose milk documented during those Russian domestication experiments deserves closer attention on its own terms, since the composition itself proved genuinely notable, containing significantly higher fat and protein content than typical cow's milk. A difference, substantial enough that researchers studying the comparison described moose milk as considerably more calorically dense per equivalent volume. This richness makes practical biological sense, given everything already established about moose calf development, since supporting the kind of rapid, dramatic weight gain documented earlier. A calf potentially doubling its birth weight within just a few weeks requires milk carrying considerably more concentrated nutrition than would be necessary for slower-growing offspring of other species. The rarity of moose milk in any commercial or widely accessible context stems primarily from practical limitations rather than any lack of nutritional interest, since moose produce milk in far smaller total volumes than dairy cattle, and the animal's fundamentally solitary, less tractable temperament makes any large-scale milking operation logistically difficult, even setting aside the genuine challenges documented in the earlier domestication attempts. A small handful of specialty operations, Most notably, a single remaining moose farm in Russia, continuing limited milk production, largely for research and novelty purposes, represent essentially the entire extent of moose milk's practical presence in the world today. This combination, genuinely remarkable nutritional density paired with almost total commercial impracticality, leaves moose milk as a fascinating biological footnote rather than any kind of widely available product. Interesting, precisely because of how thoroughly it remains tied to the specific demanding biology of the animal producing it. Despite the genuine promise shown in certain specific applications, the broader effort to domesticate moose ultimately fell short of establishing anything resembling a sustainable widespread practice, undone primarily by the animal's deeply independent temperament and a diet far too selective and specialized to accommodate easily within any conventional farming or ranching structure. Unlike cattle or horses, species that adapted relatively readily to consuming whatever feed a farmer happened to provide, moose showed a persistent, stubborn preference for specific wild browse, particular species of willow, aspen, and aquatic vegetation that proved genuinely difficult and expensive to reliably supply at any meaningful scale outside their natural habitat. This dietary specificity, combined with a temperament that resisted the kind of consistent, predictable handling domestication generally requires, meant that even the successful elements of the Russian research program, the pack animal potential, the surprisingly rich milk never translated into anything approaching genuine commercial viability. Researchers involved in these efforts eventually concluded that moose, whatever specific advantages they might theoretically offer over more established domestic animals, simply carried too many practical obstacles to overcome the deeply entrenched infrastructure and cultural familiarity already built around horses and cattle across the regions where these experiments took place. This outcome offers a genuinely interesting counterpoint to the moose's undeniable capability in the wild. An animal magnificently adapted to its natural environment, proving considerably less adaptable once removed from that environment, and asked to conform to entirely different human purposes and expectations. Turning now toward the more urgent pressures facing moose populations today. A warming climate has begun measurably reshaping where this cold-adapted species can realistically survive, with the southern edge of moose range across North America shifting steadily northward over recent decades as regions that once supported healthy populations grow progressively less hospitable to an animal so specifically built for cold. This range contraction reflects several compounding factors: direct heat stress on an animal whose dense, hollow-haired coat traps warmth so effectively that summer temperatures once comfortably tolerable now push increasingly into genuinely dangerous territory, alongside indirect pressures like habitat shifts and the expanding parasite populations explored next. States along the historic southern edge of moose range, including parts of Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Vermont, have documented measurable population declines over recent decades, trends researchers link directly to warming regional temperatures rather than any single isolated cause. This northward contraction represents a genuinely significant conservation concern, since moose occupy a relatively narrow band of suitable climate conditions to begin with, meaning even modest warming can meaningfully shrink the total habitat available to sustain healthy populations across the southern portions of their historic range. Wildlife biologists continue monitoring this shift closely, tracking population trends across different latitudes to better understand exactly how quickly and how significantly a warming climate may continue, reshaping the fundamental geography of where moose can realistically survive and thrive in the decades ahead. Among the most serious specific threats connected to a warming climate, the expanding population of winter ticks has emerged as a genuinely devastating pressure on moose populations across parts of their range, with warmer, shorter winters allowing tick numbers to multiply far beyond historical levels and infest individual moose in numbers substantial enough to cause serious illness or outright death. A single moose can end up carrying tens of thousands of these ticks simultaneously during severe infestation years, a parasite load so overwhelming that affected animals suffer significant blood loss, hair loss from excessive scratching and grooming against the irritation, and a general physical decline that leaves them dangerously vulnerable heading into the demanding winter months. Researchers studying this phenomenon sometimes documenting moose so severely affected by hair loss that wildlife biologists have taken to calling them ghost moose for their patchy, pale appearance, have linked the tick population explosion directly to warming winter conditions, since these ticks rely on a specific window of favorable weather to complete their reproductive cycle, a window that milder, shorter winters have steadily expanded in recent decades. Some regional moose populations have experienced calf mortality rates from severe tick infestation exceeding 50% in particularly bad years. A genuinely alarming figure for a species already navigating multiple compounding pressures tied to a changing climate. This tick crisis stands as one of the clearest, most direct examples of how a warming climate translates into genuine, measurable harm for a species whose entire biology remains so thoroughly built around thriving in conditions that are across growing portions of its range, becoming steadily less common. New England offers one of the clearest regional case studies of this tick crisis playing out in genuinely measurable terms, with states including New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine documenting sharp population declines in specific local moose herds directly attributable to severe winter tick infestation, compounding the broader pressures of a warming regional climate. Wildlife biologists conducting long-term monitoring in these states have tracked individual moose populations experiencing calf survival rates low enough to raise genuine concern about long-term herd sustainability. A stark contrast to the successful population recovery documented decades earlier, following the conservation efforts that once helped rebuild these same regional populations from near local extinction. This situation creates a genuinely difficult management challenge, since the underlying cause, warming winters extending the tick reproductive window, sits largely beyond the direct control of state wildlife agencies, forcing researchers and managers to focus instead on better understanding population dynamics and exploring what limited intervention options might realistically help. Affected herds. Some research has explored whether adjusted hunting quotas reducing overall moose density in affected areas might help limit tick transmission between individual animals during the critical infestation season, a strategy still being evaluated for its actual long-term effectiveness. This New England situation carries particular emotional weight, given the region's earlier conservation success story, a population once celebrated as a genuine recovery triumph, now facing a new, considerably more complicated threat that resists the kind of straightforward regulatory solutions, hunting restrictions, and habitat protection that proved so effective against the more direct pressures of a century ago. Even with the tick crisis and warming climate clearly implicated in significant regional moose declines, researchers studying the species across its broader range have encountered a genuinely puzzling pattern that resists easy explanation. Some moose populations facing severe pressure and measurable decline, while other seemingly comparable populations nearby hold remarkably steady under similar climate and habitat conditions. This inconsistency has become a genuine focus of ongoing scientific investigation, since understanding exactly why certain herds prove more resilient than others could offer real practical guidance for conservation efforts trying to protect vulnerable populations moving forward. Some researchers suspect subtle differences in local habitat quality, predator density, or even genetic variation in tick resistance among different regional populations might help explain the disparity, though no single factor has yet emerged as a fully satisfying explanation covering every documented case. Others point toward the possibility that population density itself plays a significant role, with more densely concentrated herds facing disproportionately worse tick transmission compared to more dispersed populations occupying similar climate conditions, a hypothesis that remains under active study rather than settled conclusion. This uncertainty reflects the genuine complexity involved in untangling multiple interacting environmental pressures affecting a species across a geographically vast and ecologically varied range. And wildlife biologists continue gathering long-term data across multiple regions in hopes of eventually identifying the specific combination of factors that determines which moose populations manage to weather these mounting pressures and which ones continue struggling against them. Returning now to a mystery raised earlier in this account, the bell hanging beneath a moose's chin continues to resist any fully settled scientific explanation, remaining one of the more genuinely unresolved anatomical questions found anywhere in the study of this otherwise thoroughly researched species. Despite decades of observation and several competing hypotheses, scent dispersal during the rut, visual recognition between individuals in dense forest, researchers have yet to reach the kind of confident consensus that exists around nearly every other distinctive moose, feature the antlers, the hollow hair, the specialized hooves, each thoroughly explained through established research. This persistent uncertainty says something genuinely interesting about the limits of even well-funded, long-running wildlife research. Since a feature this visible and this consistently present across the entire species has still managed to avoid full explanation despite considerable scientific attention directed toward understanding it. Some more recent research has begun exploring whether the bell might serve multiple overlapping functions simultaneously, rather than a single clear purpose, a possibility that would help explain why no single explanation has ever satisfied the available evidence. Researchers studying moose anatomy and behavior continue treating the bell as a genuine open question worth further investigation. a reminder that even an animal studied as extensively as the moose still holds onto real, unresolved mysteries hiding in plain sight on every single individual across its entire range. Building directly on that persistent uncertainty, current research into the bell's function increasingly centers on the possibility that it carries some form of signal, whether chemical scent distributed through the loose, hair-covered skin, or a purely visual cue used in recognition between individuals that researchers simply have not yet found the right methodology to fully decode and confirm. Some biologists studying the bell's physical structure have noted that the tissue itself contains scent glands whose specific function and output remain incompletely characterized, a detail that lends some credibility to the scent signaling hypothesis, without yet providing definitive confirmation of exactly what information, if any, that scent might actually communicate to other moose. The visual signaling hypothesis draws support from the bell's consistent presence and relatively similar appearance across the entire species, a pattern that would make sense if the structure functions as some kind of recognizable dot or light identifying feature useful in dense forest terrain where full-body visual contact between individuals often proves limited or entirely obstructed. Neither hypothesis has yet been confirmed through the kind of controlled, definitive research that would settle the question permanently, and researchers acknowledge that advancing this particular area of study faces genuine, practical challenges since testing scent or visual signaling function in a large, difficult-to-handle wild animal presents considerably more logistical obstacles than similar research conducted on smaller, more easily studied species. The bell remains for now a genuinely open scientific question, one small but persistent reminder that thorough study of an animal's biology does not always guarantee complete understanding of every feature that biology includes. The remarkable navigational precision documented earlier, cows returning to the same specific calving grounds year after year, moose following consistent seasonal migration routes between wetland and forest habitat, continues to raise genuine scientific questions about exactly how this navigation actually works at a mechanistic level. Questions researchers have not yet fully resolved, despite considerable observational documentation of the behavior itself. Unlike species whose long-distance navigation researchers have traced to specific, well-understood mechanisms, magnetic field sensitivity in certain migratory birds, for instance, the precise sensory and cognitive tools a moose relies on to navigate its own home range with such apparent precision remain considerably less well understood. Current research explores several possible contributing factors: simultaneously detailed spatial memory built through repeated experience navigating the same territory, scent-based landmark recognition drawing on the moose's already well-documented olfactory sensitivity, and potentially some combination of subtle environmental cues, terrain, contour, vegetation patterns that researchers have not yet fully isolated or confirmed through controlled study. Tracking technology has advanced considerably in recent years, allowing researchers to document the routes and patterns themselves with far greater precision than earlier field observation alone could achieve. But translating that behavioral data into genuine understanding of the underlying navigational mechanism remains an active, ongoing area of research, rather than a settled conclusion. This gap between observed behavior and mechanistic understanding reflects a broader pattern found throughout wildlife science: the ability to document what an animal does, often outpacing researchers' capacity to fully explain exactly how or why that animal manages to do it with such consistent, reliable precision. Facing the compounding pressures of rising temperatures, expanding tick populations, and shifting habitat conditions documented throughout this account, wildlife researchers across North America and Scandinavia have committed to sustained, long-term population monitoring, specifically aimed at building the kind of predictive understanding that might eventually help identify which specific moose populations carry the greatest resilience against a genuinely warming world, and which face the most urgent need for active conservation intervention. This monitoring effort involves tracking multiple factors simultaneously across numerous regional populations: calf survival rates, tick infestation severity, seasonal movement patterns, and overall population density, gathering the kind of comprehensive, multi-year dataset necessary to eventually distinguish meaningful patterns from simple, year-to-year variation that might otherwise mask genuine long-term trends. Researchers involved in this work acknowledge that fully answering these questions will likely require considerably more time and data than currently available, since distinguishing genuine climate-driven population decline from natural fluctuation requires the kind of sustained multi-decade observation that wildlife science is only now beginning to accumulate in sufficient depth. The stakes behind this research extend well beyond simple scientific curiosity too, since the practical conservation decisions facing wildlife agencies today hunting quota adjustments, habitat protection priorities, potential intervention strategies against tick infestation, all depend heavily on the kind of predictive understanding this long-term monitoring aims to eventually provide. It represents patient, unglamorous scientific work, the steady accumulation of data across years and decades, in service of protecting a species whose future now depends considerably more on a changing climate than on any of the more traditional pressures it has successfully weathered across its long history. Across everything gathered throughout this account, the crushing force of a defensive charge, the astonishing speed of antler regrowth, the underwater diving and independent ear rotation, the ritualized combat and long-distance vocal courtship, the staggering scale of a calf's early growth, and the deep, complicated relationship this animal holds with the humans who have hunted it, studied it, and occasionally tried to domesticate it, a clear pattern emerges that extends well beyond simple accumulated facts. Each answered question about the moose, how it survives brutal winters, how it navigates dense forest terrain, how it manages to feed on plants growing beneath open water, has consistently opened onto some further question. Researchers have not yet fully resolved the true purpose of the bell, the precise mechanism behind its navigational precision, the full explanation for why some populations weather modern pressures better than others. This pattern reflects something genuinely true about scientific understanding more broadly. That thorough knowledge of an animal's basic biology rarely translates into complete understanding of every mechanism and behavior involved, and the moose, despite standing as one of the most visible, most extensively studied, large mammals across 2 entire continents, still carries genuine, unresolved mystery within its own biology. Rather than diminishing what has already been learned, this ongoing uncertainty adds a certain depth to the whole picture. A reminder that even an animal this large, this thoroughly documented, this deeply woven into human history across multiple continents, still has more to teach than any single account could ever fully capture. Return for a moment to where this account began, an animal weighing as much as a small car moving through dense brush without a single snapped twig or rustled branch, giving away its presence, appearing suddenly at the edge of a clearing as though it had simply materialized rather than approached. That same quiet, near-silent movement runs as a thread through everything documented since. An enormous creature that dives beneath ponds without disturbing the surface for long, that navigates precise seasonal routes without any obvious trail marking. The way that carries genuine unresolved mysteries within a body most people assume science has already fully explained. Perhaps that is the real lingering question worth sitting with after everything else. How an animal built on this scale, capable of this much force, carrying this much unresolved biological mystery, still manages to move through the forests of 2 entire continents, largely unnoticed by the millions of people living at the edges of its range, glimpsed occasionally, understood only partially, and gone again into the trees before most people ever fully register what they saw. The moose does not announce itself, does not demand attention, simply continues moving through the landscape it has occupied for longer than any human settlement nearby, indifferent to how much or how little we understand about it. That quiet persistence, more than any single fact or figure gathered here, might be the truest thing about this animal, an enormous, complicated, still partially mysterious presence living its life at the edge of our own, largely unnoticed, until the moment it isn't. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Until next time, good night.